Tonight, we travel back beyond the pyramids, beyond the golden masks, beyond the carved temples and the colossal statues staring with stone eyes across the burning Egyptian sun. Tonight, we leave behind the world of pharaohs, cartouches, dynasties, and royal tombs, and step into an Egypt almost impossible to imagine, an Egypt without Khufu, without Ramses, without Cleopatra, without the great monuments that now dominate the imagination of the world, an Egypt where the Nile still flowed beneath a sky crowded with stars, but where the names of kings had not yet been written, and the gods had not yet taken their final familiar forms. This is Egypt before Egypt, a land where gods and mortals once seemed to walk the earth together, not in temples of polished stone, but in reed huts, desert camps, cattle enclosures, burial grounds, and windswept settlements scattered along the wide green banks of the Nile. Here, long before the first pyramid rose from the plateau of Giza, people watched the river rise and fall with a rhythm that must have seemed alive, deliberate, perhaps even divine. They saw the desert closing in. They saw the flood returning. They buried their dead in shallow graves beneath the sand, curled like sleepers facing the unknown, surrounded by pots, beads, ivory, stone blades, and tokens whose meanings now drift just beyond our reach. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. For thousands of years, the story of Egypt was told from the top down. It began with kings. It began with crowns. It began with Narmer, Menes, the unification of the two lands, and the sudden appearance of a civilization so complete, so ordered, so dazzling in its symbols and institutions, that it seemed almost to emerge fully formed from the desert. But archaeology, patient and unromantic in its methods, yet astonishing in its revelations, has shown us something far stranger. The pharaohs did not create Egypt from nothing. They inherited a world already ancient, already sacred, already full of memory, ritual, ambition, violence, beauty, and mystery, long before royal names were carved into stone. Communities along the Nile were experimenting with power. Long before hieroglyphs filled tomb walls, people marked objects with signs, symbols, and images that hinted at ownership, belief, identity, and control, long before the divine king stood at the center of the Egyptian cosmos. Chiefs and ritual leaders were gathering wealth, commanding labor, burying followers, and shaping the sacred landscape. The roots of Egypt run deep, deep into the mud of the Nile Valley, deep into the gravel terraces of the desert edge, deep into graves opened by stratigraphic excavation, analyzed through lithic analysis, traced through pottery styles, radiocarbon dating, and, in our own age, fragments of genomic data drawn from bones that have slept for more than 5,000 years. And what they reveal is not a simple prelude. It is not a lesser world waiting for civilization to arrive. It is a civilization in the making, but also something else entirely. Imagine the Nile Valley around 4000 BC. The air smells of wet earth, smoke, animals, and river plants. Papyrus grows thick in the marshes. Fish flash in the shallows. Birds rise suddenly in great flurries from the reeds. Beyond the black soil, the desert begins almost at once. Red, bright, vast, and pitiless. The people who live here are neither primitive shadows nor silent background figures in the story of later greatness. They are observant, adaptive, inventive. They make fine stone tools. They grind pigments. They shape pottery with elegant painted designs. They bury the dead with care. They understand the river, the seasons, the animals, the stars, and the hard limits of survival. They are our intellectual equals, standing in a world different from ours, but not lesser. Among them are hunters who know the tracks of gazelle and wild cattle, fishers who read the currents by the movement of water against reed stems, herders who guide cattle across fragile grasslands, farmers who work the dark soil where the flood has withdrawn, craft specialists whose hands are steady enough to carve ivory, polish stone, and drill beads so small that even modern eyes struggle to grasp the patience required, traders who move across difficult landscapes, carrying shells, stone, pigments, and rare goods from distances that would have felt immense, storytellers who remember ancestral places, ritual experts who know when to speak, when to bury, when to paint, when to cut, when to offer, and perhaps already rulers, not pharaohs in the later sense, not yet living gods crowned beneath the gaze of Horus, but men and women who stood apart, people buried with finer goods than their neighbors, people connected to distant exchange routes, people whose graves grew larger, whose symbols became bolder, whose communities became centers of gravity in places like Abydos, Hierakonpolis, Nakata, and other ancient sites along the Nile. Archaeology has uncovered traces of this slow transformation, not a single event, not one sudden invention, but a long, restless process through which villages became chiefdoms, chiefdoms became kingdoms, and kingship became sacred. Yet the deeper we look, the more answerless, adrift to ponder we become. Why did this happen here? Why did the Nile create one of the most enduring civilizations in human history? Was it the river itself, with its generous flood and narrow corridor of fertile land? Was it climate change? As the once greener Sahara dried and pushed communities toward the valley, was it trade, competition, ritual, warfare, or the need to organize labor and memory? Was the pharaoh born from agriculture, or from something older, something buried in ceremonies, ancestor cults, animal powers, and the dangerous magnetism of sacred authority? The old answers are no longer enough, for in pre-dynastic Egypt, the boundary between religion and politics, between practical survival and cosmic imagination, was already thin. A decorated pot was never just a container. A burial was never just disposal of the dead. A knife was never just a tool. A boat painted on pottery may have carried trade goods, souls, gods, ancestors, or power itself. A bull may have been meat, wealth, danger, masculinity, divinity, and royal force all at once in this world, meaning gathered around objects like silt after the flood, layer upon layer, visible only when the archaeologist cuts carefully through the earth and reads the ground like a broken book. We come to this forgotten Egypt not to strip away its mystery, but to stand within it, to lose ourselves among the myriad altars of a world whose people could not have known that their descendants would one day build pyramids, carve temples into cliffs, embalm kings, and send armies beneath banners of falcons and suns. They lived not as the beginning of someone else's story, but as the center of their own. They loved, feared, fought, dreamed, mourned, and looked upon the river with minds as deep as ours. And in the graves they left behind, in the painted pottery, in the stone pallets, in the bones, beads, blades, and buried settlements, something still speaks, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to tell us that before the pharaohs, there was not emptiness. There was a long human drama unfolding beneath the Egyptian sky, a drama of climate and belief, ambition and memory, blood and water, desert and flood, a drama that would eventually give birth to one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, yet which remains, in many ways, stranger than the civilization it created. So tonight, before we stand before the pyramids, before we enter the tombs of kings, before we speak the names of dynasties that echo through history like thunder, we must first walk into the deeper darkness, into the reed beds, into the desert graves, into the lost villages along the Nile, into Egypt before Egypt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. Before crowns, before cartouches, before the names of rulers were captured in signs and fixed into the long stone memory of Egypt, there were people living close to the river, close to hunger, close to the dead, and close to the powers they believed moved unseen through the world. They did not call themselves Egyptians in the way later ages would understand the word. They did not live beneath a single royal command. They did not raise pyramids into the western sky or fill palace archives with lists of tribute and grain. Their world was smaller in scale, but not smaller in meaning. It was a world of villages, seasonal camps, cattle paths, fishing places, burial grounds, and desert trails. A world where identity may have belonged first to kin, to settlement, to landscape, to animals, to ancestors, to the river bend where one was born, and to the cemetery where one expected to return. This was the human world from which Egypt slowly gathered itself. Along the Nile Valley, life depended on reading signs, not written signs at first, but the older language of water, mud, wind, and animal movement. A change in the river's color could mean distant rains far to the south. The arrival of birds could mark a shift in season. The cracking of soil, the retreat of floodwater, the behavior of cattle, the growth of wild plants. All of these were messages to be understood. Survival belonged to those who could see patterns, remember them, and pass them on. The people of this age were not wandering aimlessly through an empty land. They were shaping a cultural landscape with remarkable care. Some communities remained near the river, drawing food from fish, wild plants, birds, and cultivated plots. Others moved between ecological zones, exploiting desert margins, seasonal grazing, and river resources. Herding and farming did not replace older ways overnight. They overlapped. They blended. A person might sow grain, tend cattle, fish the river, gather plants, hunt game, and repair a stone blade, all within the same rhythm of life. This is one of the great misunderstandings of early civilization. The road to kingship was not a simple march from hunter to farmer to city dweller to state subject. It was tangled, experimental, uneven, and deeply local. The early Nile communities drew from many strategies at once. They made choices according to flood, climate, exchange, memory, and need. They were practical people, but practical in a world where the practical and the sacred were likely intertwined. A grave dug into desert sand was a practical act. It was also a statement about the soul, the body, the ancestors, and the invisible order of existence. A pot placed beside the dead could hold food, drink, offering, memory, or symbol. A necklace of beads could be ornament, identity, protection, or wealth. A carefully shaped stone tool could speak of skill, gender, rank, labor, or ritual. To modernize, these things sit behind glass in museums, quiet and labeled. But in the hands of those who made them, they were alive with intention. Archaeologists have spent generations trying to listen to those intentions. Through stratigraphic excavation, they study the layers in which people lived and died. Through radiocarbon dating, they anchor fragile traces to time. Through lithic analysis, they examine stone tools and reconstruct gestures of cutting, scraping, drilling, hunting, and crafting. Through the study of ceramics, they trace style, exchange, imitation, and identity across regions. Through bioarchaeology, they examine bones for signs of diet, disease, injury, labor, and movement. Through genomic data, still incomplete and sometimes difficult to recover from Egypt's ancient heat, they glimpse patterns of ancestry and contact. Piece by piece, a lost world begins to emerge, not as legend, not as myth, but as a lived landscape. Picture a settlement near the Nile in the 5th millennium BC. Houses built from reeds, mud, timber, and matting stand low against the land. Smoke rises from hearths. Dogs move between people. Children carry small objects, perhaps shells, perhaps scraps of clay, perhaps toys no archaeologist can confidently name. Women and men grind grain, clean fish, shape tools, tend fires, repair baskets, smooth pottery, prepare hides, and watch the sky. Cattle stand nearby. Enormous, valuable, dangerous. More than animals and not yet mere property. They are walking wealth. They are food, traction, prestige, sacrifice, and perhaps a sign of connection to powers larger than human life. In these settlements, no palace towers above the huts. No royal bureaucracy counts every basket of grain. Yet differences are beginning to appear. Some graves are richer than others. Some goods travel farther than expected. Some people seem to command more labor, more attention, more ritual investment. These are the earliest shadows of hierarchy, faint at first, then gradually sharpening. And yet, social difference did not necessarily mean tyranny. It may have begun through generosity, ritual authority, control of exotic goods, success in conflict, or the ability to mediate between communities and unseen forces. A leader in such a world might not have ruled by law in the later sense. He might have persuaded, feasted, protected, threatened, remembered lineages, organized ceremonies, arranged exchanges, or claimed descent from powerful ancestors. She might have held knowledge of healing, birth, death, plants, burial rites, and sacred places. Power may have been performed before it was imposed. There is something deeply human in this. Before government becomes an institution, it is a relationship. Before kingship becomes a crown, it is a reputation. Before a state commands, a person must convince others that they stand closer to order than chaos. That may be what we are seeing in pre-dynastic Egypt, not the sudden creation of a nation, but the slow gathering of trust, fear, wealth, violence, ritual, and memory into human bodies set apart from others. The future pharaoh was not born in a palace. He was assembled over centuries from chiefs, hunters, herders, ritual specialists, warriors, ancestors, and symbols. The villages of early Egypt were laboratories of identity. In one region, pottery forms might express local pride. In another, burial customs might differ slightly, marking belonging even in death. Some communities placed the dead in contracted positions, bodies drawn inward as if returning to the womb of the earth. Some included objects that suggest personal adornment, food offerings, or status. Some cemeteries expanded across generations, becoming ancestral maps written not with ink, but with bones beneath sand. These ancestors mattered. The dead were not simply gone. They occupied places. They created claims. They bound people to land. A burial ground could become a source of legitimacy, a sacred archive of belonging. To live near the graves of one's forebears was to stand within a chain of memory. To control such a place might be to control the story of a community itself. In the desert margins, the atmosphere changes. The green world of the Nile narrows. The air becomes sharper, brighter, less forgiving. Here, rock outcrops, dry wadis, and empty horizons frame a different kind of sacred geography. People moved through these spaces for stone, minerals, grazing, hunting, travel, and perhaps vision. The desert was not merely absence. It was danger, ordeal, transformation. Later, Egypt would imagine the fertile valley and the desert as opposing realms, one black and living, the other red and chaotic. That contrast may have roots deep in this prehistoric experience, when survival required constant negotiation between river abundance and desert severity. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know their songs. We do not know the names spoken over graves. We do not know the jokes told beside fires, the fears whispered when floods failed, the stories told to children about animals, stars, ancestors, and the first beings. Their language is mostly lost to us. Their myths survive only as shadows cast backward from later symbols. Their emotional world must be approached gently, through fragments. But fragments are not nothing. A shard of pottery can reveal taste, trade, and time. A bone can reveal disease, labor, ancestry, or violence. A shell carried far from the sea can reveal desire for distance, rarity, and connection. A cemetery can reveal a society thinking about death. A settlement can reveal habits repeated day after day until they became tradition. And from these fragments comes a powerful truth. Egypt was not founded only by kings. It was made first by villagers, herders, fishers, potters, hunters, mourners, traders, children, elders, and the unnamed dead. It was made by people who learned to live with the Nile, not as a backdrop, but as a force. It was made by communities who discovered that memory could be stored in objects, authority could be staged in ritual, and identity could survive beyond a single lifetime. Before crowns, there were hands shaping clay. Before cartouches, there were marks of belonging. Before pharaohs, there were ancestors beneath the sand. And in those quiet centuries, under the heat of the Egyptian sun, something immense was beginning to gather itself along the river. The Nile's first architects did not build in stone. They built with memory, mud, reed, rhythm, and return. They built by watching the flood rise in its season, spread across the low fields, withdraw again, and leave behind the dark skin of fertile soil on which life could be remade. Their architecture was not yet the pyramid, not yet the temple pylon, not yet the tomb cut deep into desert cliffs. It was the architecture of settlement itself, the careful choosing of places where people could endure. To understand the earliest shaping of Egypt, one must first stand beside the river and see it not as scenery, but as an engine of history. The Nile was not simply water. It was movement through a hostile world. To the east and west stretched desert, radiant and immense, where stone ridges burned under the sun and wind moved sand across empty ground. But through this arid immensity ran a green corridor, narrow, bending, alive. The river carried fish, birds, silt, reeds, clay, and possibility. It created marshes, islands, flood basins, grazing grounds, and fields. It connected distant communities while also dividing them by cataract, bend, swamp, and season. Human beings came to know this corridor with extraordinary intimacy. They learned where the flood reached and where it did not. They learned which ground stayed dry enough for houses, which land softened for planting, which pools trapped fish, which places attracted birds, and which desert tracks led towards stone, minerals, pasture, or danger. Such knowledge was never abstract. It was carried in bodies, in footsteps, in stories, in the practiced hands of those who could shape a basket, cut reeds, repair a net, dig a storage pit, guide cattle, or recognize when the river's behavior had begun to change. The annual inundation gave the Nile Valley a character unlike many other early farming landscapes. Rainfall in Egypt itself was never the true heart of abundance. The gift came from far away, from seasonal rains beyond the immediate world of those who waited along the riverbanks. This made the flood feel mysterious. Its causes were distant, hidden, and grand. One year it might arrive generously, another year it might disappoint. A flood too low could bring hunger. A flood too high could destroy homes, animals, stored grain, and newly established fields. So life beside the Nile required flexibility. The earliest farming communities did not conquer nature. They negotiated with it. They placed their settlements on slightly raised ground. They used flood recession agriculture, sowing where water had withdrawn and silt remained. They combined cultivation with fishing, herding, gathering, hunting, and exchange. They likely moved animals between pasture zones and adjusted labor to the changing seasons. The valley was not a fixed stage. It breathed. It expanded and contracted. Its usable spaces shifted with water and time. The first architects of Egypt, then, were planners of survival. They may not have drawn maps on papyrus, but they carried maps in collective memory. They understood the slope of land by experience. They knew the difference between safe elevation and dangerous low ground. They knew where clay could be taken for pottery, where reeds grew best for matting and walls, where flint could be gathered, where fields could be opened, and where the dead could be buried beyond the damp reach of the flood. The relationship between settlement and cemetery is especially revealing. The living often occupied the valley floor or its edges, while the dead were placed in desert ground, where dry sand could preserve bodies with startling natural efficiency. The desert became a place of endings, but also of permanence. The river valley was green, fertile, changing, and vulnerable to decay. The desert was dry, silent, preserving, and severe. Without building a single monument, these communities had already begun arranging existence into powerful symbolic zones. Green life by the water, dry memory in the sand. Such patterns would echo through Egyptian civilization for millennia. Yet in these early ages, nothing was inevitable. Egypt did not have to become what it became. The Nile offered potential, but potential is not destiny. Communities had to learn how to coordinate labor, store surplus, settle disputes, defend resources, maintain exchange, and transmit knowledge. The river encouraged connection, but it also created competition. A good fishing place, a reliable pasture, a fertile basin, a strategic crossing, or access to stone could become valuable enough to protect. The archaeological traces of these early settlements are often modest. Post holes, hearths, storage pits, pottery sherds, stone tools, animal bones, charred plant remains, floors hardened by repeated use, refuse deposits built from daily acts so ordinary that no one performing them could have imagined they would become evidence in a future science. Yet these traces reveal a profound transformation. People were not merely passing through the landscape. They were returning to places, investing labor, and organizing space. A hut of reeds and mud may vanish, but the decision to build it marks a shift in human intention. A storage pit speaks of planning. A grinding stone speaks of repeated food processing. A hearth speaks of gathering, warmth, craft, and meal. A cluster of houses speaks of cooperation. A cemetery speaks of belonging. The Nile's first architects created social landscapes before monumental landscapes. They made places recognizable. They made routes dependable. They made burial grounds sacred through repetition. They made certain river bends matter more than others. Over generations, these choices accumulated. What began as practical settlement could become ancestral territory. What began as a useful path could become a trade route. What began as a seasonal camp could become a village. What began as a village could become a center. Environmental change sharpened this process. Across North Africa, landscapes that had once supported richer grasslands, lakes, and mobile communities gradually became drier. The Great Desert was not always as barren as it appears now. There were times when people hunted, herded, and camped in regions that would later become almost uninhabitable. As aridity increased, Groups were drawn toward more reliable water. The Nile Valley, with its ribbon of life, became increasingly important. This gathering of people may have brought innovation. It may also have brought tension. Different communities, with different traditions, animals, technologies, ornaments, and burial customs, would have encountered one another along the valley. Some may have blended peacefully. Some may have competed. Some may have exchanged marriage partners, tools, pigments, stories, and ritual practices. Others may have fought. In this compression of human life along the river, new forms of identity could emerge. People began to see themselves not only as families or bands, but as members of larger communities tied to place, ancestry, and shared ways of doing things. The river was a road as much as a resource. Boats and reed craft could move people, goods, and ideas along its length. Even simple water travel would have changed the scale of imagination. A person could hear of communities far downstream or upstream, of unusual pottery, rare stone, distant animals, powerful leaders, strange rituals, and desirable ornaments. The Nile allowed local worlds to remain distinct while making isolation difficult. Along this watery spine, culture began to thicken. Pottery styles became markers of time and region. Stone tools reflected skill, function, and access to materials. Animal remains show choices in herding, hunting, and diet. Plant remains reveal cultivation and gathering. Burials show increasing attention to the display of identity. All of this suggests communities not merely surviving, but making worlds of meaning around survival. There's a temptation to imagine the first farmers as people who escaped uncertainty. In truth, they entered new kinds of uncertainty. Fields can fail. Herds can sicken. Stored grain can be stolen. Sedentary life can increase disease. Growing populations can strain local resources. To settle is not simply to become safe. It is to become invested, exposed, attached, and vulnerable. And so organization mattered. Someone had to decide when to plant, when to move animals, when to repair structures, when to harvest reeds, when to fish certain channels, when to prepare storage, when to bury the dead, and when to hold ceremonies that bound the community together. Authority may have grown from competence long before it hardened into command. The best flood watcher, the most successful herder, the keeper of ancestral knowledge, the organizer of feasts, the mediator of disputes, the person believed to understand the will of unseen forces. Any of these figures could become a seed of leadership. This is how architecture begins without walls of stone. It begins in arrangements of people. It begins in shared calendars. It begins in remembered floods. It begins in the division between the place of the living and the place of the dead. It begins when land becomes more than land, when a river bend becomes home, when a burial ground becomes ancestry, when a path becomes tradition, when the flood becomes not only a natural event, but a sacred drama upon which all existence depends. The Nile's first architects built a civilization of attention. They observed everything because everything mattered. The height of water, the movement of birds, the condition of cattle, the color of soil, the coming of heat, the drying of grass, the silence of the desert, the bodies of the dead resting beyond the fields. Their world was alive with signs, and to live well was to read them. Still, much remains answerless. Adrift to ponder, we do not know how they named the flood, or whether they sang to it. We do not know what stories were told when the river first began to rise. We do not know if children were warned away from crocodiles with myth, memory, or both. We do not know how many failed settlements vanished without trace, or how many experiments in living were abandoned before one pattern endured. But the ground gives us enough to understand this. Long before Egypt was crowned, the Nile had already taught human beings to think in cycles, boundaries, returns, and transformations. It taught them that death could preserve, that water could resurrect, that black soil could rise from chaos, that life depended on forces both measurable and mysterious. And from this lesson, patiently learned across uncounted generations, the first outlines of Egypt were drawn, not in ink, not in stone, but in mud, memory, floodwater, and sand. In the desert graves of ancient Egypt, the dead were not hidden from the world so much as entrusted to another one. They lay in the sand beyond the green edge of the Nile, where the living fields ended and the dry country began. There, beneath a sky of white heat and impossible stars. Bodies were placed into shallow pits, often curled tightly on their sides, knees drawn toward the chest, hands near the face, as if sleep, birth, and death had somehow become one gesture. Around them, the living arranged objects with care, pots filled with food or drink, stone tools sharpened by practiced hands, beads of shell, bone, ivory, and stone, combs, palettes, pigments, animal remains, and ornaments that once touched skin. These graves are among the most intimate archives in all of archaeology. A palace may speak of power. A monument may speak of command. A battlefield may speak of violence. But a grave speaks of a final act between the living and the dead. It is an event of grief, belief, memory, and decision. Someone dug the pit. Someone carried the body. Someone chose what should accompany it. Someone placed the head in a certain direction. Someone covered the grave and walked away, leaving behind an arrangement never meant for our eyes, yet preserved by dryness, silence, and time. In these burial grounds, the earliest Egyptians did not leave written explanations. They left patterns, and patterns, carefully studied, can become a kind of language. Stratigraphic excavation allows archaeologists to understand how cemeteries developed through time. A grave is not merely a hole in the ground, it is part of a larger sequence. Some burials cut into older deposits. Some lie clustered with others. Some stand apart. Some are simple. Some are rich. Some contain a single pot. Others contain many objects, perhaps imported, perhaps rare, perhaps carrying meanings no label can fully recover. The depth of a pit, the posture of a body, the location of grave goods, the age and sex of the deceased, the orientation of the head, the presence of animal offerings, all become evidence. Radiocarbon dating gives these silent places a rough position within time, although never without complexity. Organic remains, charcoal, bone, plant fibers, and other materials can be measured, calibrated, compared, and placed into chronological frameworks. Pottery typology sharpens the picture further, because ceramic styles changed across generations, leaving behind sequences of form, decoration, clay, and technique. A painted vessel can become more than an object. It can become a timestamp, a cultural marker, a trace of taste and connection. The desert itself acted as a great preserver. Long before artificial mummification became a royal and priestly art, Egypt's sand could dry bodies naturally. Skin, hair, textiles, and organic material sometimes survived in ways that astonished those who first opened such graves. To look upon these remains is to encounter not an abstraction, but a human being, a face drawn by death and dryness, hair still present, hands still shaped like hands, a body not yet transformed into the elaborate theology of later embalming, but already treated as something requiring care beyond ordinary disposal. Why place the dead in the desert? The answer may lie partly in practicality. Dry ground preserved bodies better than damp floodplain soil. The desert edge was safe from the annual inundation. It offered stable ground beyond the fields of daily labor, yet practicality alone feels too small. Across millennia, Egyptians would associate the West, the setting sun, and the desert with death, transformation, and the realm beyond life. Whether these later ideas descend directly from pre-dynastic customs cannot be proven in every detail, but the deep relationship between dry land, burial, preservation, and sacred memory clearly began very early. Here, death was geography. The living remained near water, crops, animals, and settlement. The dead rested in dryness, silence, and endurance. Every burial helped draw a map of existence. A village might vanish, huts might rot, floods might erase floors and hearths, but cemeteries could remain, generation after generation, accumulating ancestors in the same desert zone. Such places may have anchored communities to land more powerfully than any house. To return to a cemetery was to return to one's own history beneath the sand. Some graves show little difference from others. Some show striking inequality. This matters. In certain pre-dynastic cemeteries, a few burials contain far richer goods than the rest. Fine pottery, cosmetic palettes, stone vessels, ivory objects, beads requiring difficult labor, materials brought from distant places. These were not random accumulations. They suggest that some individuals were remembered, displayed, or honored differently. Perhaps they belonged to important families. Perhaps they held ritual authority. Perhaps they controlled exchange networks. Perhaps they were children of powerful lineages whose status existed before they could personally earn it. A child buried with rare goods can reveal a society in which rank is no longer only achieved through age, skill, or personal reputation. It may be inherited. That single possibility changes everything. For here, beneath the sand, one sees the faint outline of hierarchy hardening across generations. Not yet the palace, not yet the throne, not yet the divine king seated above all others, but the beginnings of unequal memory, unequal burial, unequal access to objects, labor, and symbolic power. The cemetery becomes a stage where social order is performed at the moment of death. Yet these people were not merely displaying wealth. They were communicating with forces they believed mattered. Grave goods may have served the dead in an afterlife, protected them, fed them, identified them, honored them, or bound them to the living. Cosmetic palettes, often associated with grinding pigments, may suggest bodily adornment, ritual preparation, medicine, beauty, protection, or status. Red ochre, green minerals, black pigments, and polished surfaces belong to a world in which color itself carried potency. The body was not ignored. It was arranged. Its posture mattered. Its wrapping mattered. Its direction may have mattered. Its relationship to objects mattered. In some graves, the head is oriented consistently. In others, variation appears. Such details tempt interpretation, but they also warn us to move carefully. Archaeology can reveal what was done. It cannot always reveal what was believed. Still, belief leaves fingerprints in repetition. When many people across time and space treat bodies with care, include offerings, and return to burial grounds, we are not looking at disposal. We are looking at ritual. The graves also reveal lives of labor and hardship. Bioarchaeology can examine bones for signs of disease, nutrition, injury, stress, and physical activity. Teeth may reveal diet, wear, childhood stress, and the gritty consequences of grain ground with stone. Skeletons may show healed fractures, joint strain, infection, or trauma. These remains remind us that ancient life was not only symbolic and sacred, it was physical, demanding, and often painful. People carried loads, walked long distances, processed food, worked with tools, endured illness, and faced dangers from animals, other humans, childbirth, infection, hunger, and climate. A necklace in a grave may glow with beauty. A spine may speak of burden. A skull may whisper of violence. A tooth may remember childhood hunger. This is why the archaeology of the dead is so powerful. It holds contradiction, tenderness and inequality, beauty and suffering, ritual care and bodily exhaustion. A carefully painted pot beside a person whose bones show a hard life. An honored burial in a society where many others received little. The dead do not give us a single story. They give us a human one. Animal remains in graves add another layer of mystery. Dogs, cattle, gazelles, birds, and other creatures appear in certain contexts across pre-dynastic Egypt. Animals were food, companions, symbols, offerings, wealth, and powers of the natural world. A dog buried near humans might speak of companionship or protection. Cattle bones might speak of feasting, status, sacrifice, or wealth. Wild animals might carry associations with danger, hunting, desert power, or transformation. The later Egyptian world would fill its divine imagination with animal forms: falcons, jackals, bulls, cows, crocodiles, cats, ibises, and serpents. In these earlier graves, one may glimpse the deep root of that symbolic universe. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No inscription explains the funeral. No priestly manual survives from these communities. No mourner's voice has been preserved. We do not know whether the burial was accompanied by song, silence, fire, food, weeping, dance, or formal speech. We do not know whether the dead were feared, loved, consulted, or imagined as traveling into a distant realm. We do not know whether every person received ritual care, or whether many disappeared without trace into shallow, lost, or eroded graves. But the surviving burials reveal enough to overturn any simple idea of pre-royal Egypt as a crude beginning. These were people thinking deeply about death. They understood that a human life did not simply vanish. It required placement. It required gesture. It required objects. It required memory. They transformed the desert margin into a sacred archive, where bodies became ancestors and ancestors became claims upon the land. Beneath the sand, they stored not only the dead, but social order, family identity, spiritual imagination, and the first long murmurs of Egyptian eternity. The grave is one of humanity's oldest arguments against oblivion. In pre-dynastic Egypt, that argument was made with clay vessels, stone blades, beads, pigments, animal offerings, and bodies curled carefully into the earth. Each burial was a sentence in a language not fully readable, yet unmistakably deliberate. Each cemetery was a book written downward, not on pages, but in layers of sand and silence. And when modern hands uncover these places with brush, trowel, patience, and restraint, the ancient dead return not as curiosities, but as witnesses. They tell us that Egypt's obsession with eternity did not begin in pyramids. It began in shallow graves beneath the desert sun. It began when the living looked upon the dead and decided that something must remain. Naqada rises from the archaeological record like a shadow lengthening across the Nile, not as a single city commanding all things from the beginning, not as an empire, not as a royal dynasty with polished titles and obedient provinces. It appears first through patterns, through pottery, through graves, through craft, through the slow concentration of wealth and ambition in certain places along the river. It is a culture, a horizon, a transforming world, and one of the great engines behind the birth of ancient Egypt. The name itself comes from a place in Upper Egypt, but the story reaches far beyond one settlement. Across the 4th millennium BC, communities associated with Naqada culture expanded in influence, absorbing, replacing, imitating, trading with, and reshaping neighboring traditions. What had once been a landscape of many local worlds began to show signs of wider connection. Styles spread, objects moved, symbols grew bolder, cemeteries became more unequal, craft production became more refined. Certain settlements gathered importance like storm clouds over the valley. Here, the old village world did not simply disappear, it intensified. At Naqada and related sites, archaeologists found pottery unlike anything ordinary necessity alone would demand. Vessels were shaped with skill and decorated with lines, spirals, boats, animals, human figures, plants, and mysterious standards. Some pots were red with black tops, their colors produced through controlled firing techniques that required experience and attention. Others carried pale surfaces painted with dark images that seemed to drift between the practical and the mythic. These were not merely containers for grain, beer, fat, or water. They were statements of identity, display, and perhaps sacred imagination. A pot could travel, a pot could be seen, a pot could be placed in a grave and speak for the dead. Through ceramic analysis, archaeologists trace changes in form and decoration across time, building sequences that help order the centuries before written history. The evolution of Naqada pottery is not just a matter of art history, it is a map of social change. When a style appears across a wide region, it suggests connection. When certain forms become associated with elite graves, it suggests status. When pottery is mass-produced or standardized, it hints at specialists, workshops, demand, and distribution. Clay becomes evidence for a society growing more complex. The same is true of stone. Fine flint knives from pre-dynastic Egypt are among the most astonishing objects ever made by human hands. Some were ripple-flaked with extraordinary precision, their surfaces worked into delicate waves of stone. Such blades could cut, but their craftsmanship goes far beyond simple utility. They required trained skill, excellent material, time, and a social context that valued technical mastery. A blade of this kind might serve in ritual, display, exchange, or elite burial. It could represent power controlled through beauty. Lithic analysis allows us to see not only the finished object, but the sequence of decisions behind it, the selection of raw material, the preparation of the core, the angle of each strike, the pressure applied along an edge, the expertise embedded in a tool. In the Naqada world, certain crafts were becoming specialized. Not everyone could make such things. Not everyone could own them. The distance between ordinary household production and elite display was widening, and with that widening distance, society changed. The cemeteries tell this story with particular force. Some graves become larger and richer. Some contain goods from far away. Some are lined or structured with greater care. Some individuals are buried with objects that would have required access to specialized craftspeople and exchange networks. The dead, once more, become witnesses to the living order. A society that buries some people with many valuable goods and others with few is a society thinking in ranks. Whether those ranks were based on lineage, authority, ritual power, wealth, violence, or all of these at once. Nakata's rising shadow also falls across the question of trade. Materials found in pre-dynastic contexts point toward roots extending beyond the immediate Nile Valley. Shells from distant waters, stones from desert sources, metals, pigments, ivory, and exotic objects show that communities were connected to broad networks of movement. Goods may have passed hand to hand across many communities rather than through direct long-distance expeditions, but the result was the same. Certain people had access to rarity, and rarity has always been close to power. To possess what others cannot easily obtain is to stand apart. This may be one of the roots of elite authority in pre-dynastic Egypt. A leader who could gather rare materials, sponsor skilled artisans, organize feasts, command labor, and distribute prestige goods could make power visible. Authority had to be seen. It had to be touched, worn, buried, consumed, and remembered. In a world without written royal decrees, objects could proclaim what words could not yet permanently record. Nakata culture was also a world of images. Boats appear repeatedly on decorated pottery. They glide across painted surfaces with cabins, standards, oars, and sometimes human figures. At one level, boats reflect the practical reality of the Nile, the great highway of the land. But these boats seem to carry more than passengers. They may evoke journeys of the living, journeys of the dead, processions, trade expeditions, ritual movement, or cosmic travel. The boat would later become one of Egypt's most enduring religious forms, carrying gods, kings, and souls through seen and unseen realms. In Nakata imagery, the idea already seems alive, though its exact meaning remains answerless, adrift to ponder. Animals also fill the visual world: birds, cattle, crocodiles, serpents, scorpions, desert creatures, river creatures, beings of marsh, field, and waste. These were not decorations in the shallow sense. Animals embodied powers humans observed with awe: the bull's strength, the falcon's height, the crocodile's terror, the scorpion's venom, the hippopotamus's violence, the desert animal's endurance. To depict such creatures was perhaps to invoke, control, honor, or identify with their force. The later gods of Egypt would wear animal forms with unforgettable power. The Nakata world suggests that this imagination did not appear suddenly. It grew from long familiarity with animals as companions, dangers, food, symbols, and presences at the edge of human control. At Hierakonpolis, one of the most important pre-dynastic centers, discoveries reveal a society of unusual scale and complexity. There were craft areas, cemeteries, elite tombs, evidence of brewing, animal burials, and signs of ritual activity. The site gives a glimpse of what a powerful Upper Egyptian center may have been like before formal kingship crystallized. Here, people gathered, produced, consumed, displayed, buried, and perhaps competed in ways that seem larger than village life. Beer may have mattered deeply in such places, not as a trivial pleasure, but as a social technology. Brewing required grain, labor, containers, knowledge, and organization. Beer could feed workers, mark ceremonies, support feasting, and bind people together under the generosity of a host. A powerful person able to sponsor large gatherings could transform food and drink into loyalty. Feasts are not merely meals. They are political theater. They create memory. They display abundance. They make hierarchy feel communal, even joyful. This is one of the subtle pathways by which power grows, not always through conquest at first, sometimes through gifts, sometimes through rituals, sometimes through the ability to gather people at the right moment and make them feel part of something greater than themselves. Yet Nakata's expansion was not necessarily gentle. Cultural influence can spread through admiration, marriage, trade, migration, elite emulation, and peaceful contact. It can also spread through pressure, domination, and violence. The archaeological record hints at competition among communities as power became concentrated. The Nile was rich, but it was narrow. Prestige was desirable, but not infinite. Control of routes, fields, herds, crafts, and symbols could create rivalries. Out of such rivalries, stronger polities emerged. The story becomes one of convergence. Upper Egypt, especially the region associated with Nakata and other powerful centers, seems to have developed forms of social complexity that would eventually dominate the valley. Local differences did not vanish overnight, but a shared symbolic and material language grew more influential. Certain images, objects, and practices began to speak across distance. Authority became more formal. Elites became more visible. Ritual power gathered around centers. The world of many communities began to lean toward political unification. Still, for the most part, secrets remained hidden. We do not know what these people called themselves. We do not know the names of their chiefs, except perhaps in the faintest late pre-dynastic signs. We do not know the full meaning of their painted boats, standards, masks, animal images, and burial arrangements. We do not know how many songs, myths, vows, threats, marriages, and betrayals moved beneath the surface of the archaeological record. We see the durable remains, but not the breath that animated them. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. Nakata was not a footnote. It was a furnace. In that furnace, older village traditions were melted together with trade, craft specialization, ritual display, hierarchy, and political ambition. The raw materials of the Egyptian state were heated, shaped, and hardened. Pottery became identity. Graves became rank. Exotic goods became authority. Animals became symbols of power. Boats became images of movement through life, death, and sacred space. Leaders became more than successful individuals. They began to appear as figures standing between community, cosmos, ancestors, and force. A civilization was forming, but not in silence. It formed through hands painting pottery in dim light, through flint knappers striking stone with impossible precision, through mourners lowering rare objects into graves, through traders carrying shells, minerals, and stories across harsh distances, through feasts where beer flowed and loyalties were made, through cemeteries where inequality became visible beneath the sand, through symbols that outlived the people who first painted them. Nakata's shadow lengthened until it touched almost every part of the Nile Valley. In that shadow, Egypt was no longer merely a collection of communities living beside a river. It was becoming an idea powerful enough to gather people, land, memory, violence, and divinity into one vast historical current. And once such a current begins to move, only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, and how much of that vanished world still waits beneath the Egyptian dust. Black land and red land, two worlds pressed together beneath the Egyptian sun, one dark, wet, fertile, and alive with insects, birds, fish, cattle, reeds, crops, and human settlement, the other bright, dry, stony, and immense, stretching outward into silence, heat, mirage, and death. To later Egyptians, this contrast became one of the great organizing ideas of existence. The black land was the cultivated valley, renewed by the flood. The red land was desert, danger, foreignness, chaos, and the realm beyond ordinary life. But long before such ideas were carved into royal ideology, the contrast was already real in the bodies and decisions of those who lived there. The Nile Valley was never isolated from the desert. It was defined by it. To stand at the edge of cultivation was to see the world divide sharply. Behind you, mud, growth, damp air, voices, animals, smoke, and food. Ahead of you, gravel plains, cliffs, wadis, sun-hammered stone, and distances that could swallow the unprepared. No gentle transitions softened the boundary. Egypt was a ribbon of life held between two walls of desolation. This geography created a particular kind of imagination, one trained to think in opposites, in thresholds, in movement between safety and danger, nourishment and thirst, home and wilderness, living body and preserved corpse. Yet the red land had not always been so empty. Across great stretches of North Africa, climate had shifted dramatically across millennia. There were ages when regions now consumed by desert-held lakes, grasslands, animals, and human communities. People hunted where sand now reigns. They herded cattle where only stone and wind remain. They camped beside waters that vanished so completely that only geological traces and archaeological scatters remained to testify to their former life. The Sahara was not eternally dead. It was transformed, and this transformation changed everything. As aridity increased, landscapes that had once supported mobile hunters, herders, and mixed communities became less reliable. Waterholes shrank, grasslands retreated, animals moved or disappeared. Routes became harder. Places remembered by grandparents as usable may have become dangerous by the time their grandchildren came of age. Climate change was not an abstract process. It was hunger. It was movement. It was the failure of known places. It was the breaking of old maps carried in memory. The Nile, by contrast, remained not always generous, not always predictable, but present. It cut through drying worlds like a promise. As surrounding regions became more difficult, the river corridor became increasingly attractive, perhaps increasingly crowded, and certainly increasingly significant. People, animals, traditions, technologies, and beliefs may have been drawn toward its banks. In this gathering lay both opportunity and pressure. Environmental stress can create innovation, but it can also create conflict. When habitable land narrows, the value of reliable resources rises. Fields matter more, pastures matter more, river access matters more, fishing grounds, clay sources, flint deposits, crossings, and desert routes all become part of a landscape of competition. The Nile did not merely feed people, it concentrated them. It forced communities into relation with one another. Some relations would have been peaceful, built on exchange, marriage, shared ceremony, and mutual need. Others may have been tense, shaped by rivalry, raiding, exclusion, and the defense of territory. In this world, survival demanded organization. Floods had to be watched. Food had to be stored. Animals had to be protected. Movements between valley and desert edge had to be planned. Harvests had to be timed. Risk had to be distributed across families and communities. A society living under environmental uncertainty cannot remain entirely casual in its arrangements. The more people depend on a shared rhythm, the more important it becomes to manage that rhythm. Here, the seeds of authority may have taken root. A person who understood the flood could become important. A person who knew distant water sources could save lives. A person who controlled herds could feed others or deny them. A person who organized labor at the right moment could turn a dangerous season into survival. A person believed to speak with ancestors, spirits, or powers of the sky and river could transform ecological knowledge into sacred authority. Climate did not create kings by itself, but climate helped create the conditions in which leadership mattered. The Black Land offered abundance, yet it required timing. After the inundation withdrew, fields had to be worked. Seeds had to enter the damp soil before opportunity passed. Harvests had to be gathered, processed, stored, and guarded. Grain could become more than food. It could become wealth held against the future. Stored surplus changes relationships. It allows feasting. It supports specialists. It feeds dependence. It attracts thieves. It requires protection. It can be measured, redistributed, promised, and withheld. In the Red Land, different values ruled. The desert contained stone, minerals, pigments, routes, hunting grounds, and sacred isolation. It was a place of risk, but not uselessness. Flint, hard stones, gold-bearing regions, ochre, and other materials drew people outward from the Green Valley. Expeditions into dry country required knowledge and perhaps leadership. Such journeys may have carried practical, economic, and ritual significance together. The desert was a storehouse of rare things, and rare things could be transformed into status. The contrast between Black Land and Red Land therefore created a powerful economic system. The valley produced food and population. The desert provided minerals, stones, pigments, animals, symbolic danger, and burial space. Communities that could move between these zones, or control others who did, held advantages. The edge between cultivation and desert was not merely a border. It was a hinge on which early Egyptian society turned. This edge also shaped the imagination of death. Bodies placed in desert graves were removed from the wet decay of the cultivated world and given to dry preservation. The dead rested not in the black soil of planting, but in the red land of endurance. The sun set beyond the western desert. Shadows lengthened there. The living watched light die in that direction every evening, only to see it return from the opposite horizon each morning. Such daily theater must have mattered. The landscape itself seemed to teach that disappearance and return were linked, that death and renewal formed a cycle written across the sky. In time, the Egyptian mind would become famous for its devotion to cosmic order, for its effort to hold chaos at bay. The roots of that worldview may lie in the lived experience of this narrow valley. Order was not a philosophical luxury. It was the difference between flood and famine, stored grain and empty jars, pasture and dead cattle, safe travel and thirst, burial and oblivion. Chaos had a geography. It waited beyond the fields. It blew in as sand. It came as failed flood, disease, raiders, wild animals, or too much water at the wrong time. The black land had to be defended, renewed, and ritually affirmed. The red land had to be feared, entered, used, and transformed. No wonder the people of the Nile became masters of boundary making. Boundaries between village and cemetery, between cultivated field and desert, between ordinary object and sacred object, between human and animal power, between living body and ancestral presence, between leader and follower, between known settlement and dangerous horizon. These boundaries were not rigid walls. They were zones of crossing, and crossings are always charged with meaning. The drying of the wider landscape may also have compressed different cultural traditions into the Nile Valley. People arriving from desert regions may have brought memories of lost waters, cattle symbolism, hunting rituals, rock art traditions, and different ways of reading the sky. In the valley, these traditions could mingle with riverine life. The result may have been a society unusually rich in symbolic material, where cattle, boats, wild animals, desert creatures, birds, and water all carried deep associations. This helps explain why early Egypt feels so full of images. It was born from a meeting of ecological worlds, the herder's world and the farmer's world, the fisher's world and the desert traveler's world, the burial ground and the settlement, the seasonal flood and the permanent horizon, the abundance of mud and the purity of stone. Such meetings do not produce simple cultures. They produce dense ones. They produce traditions layered with memory, adaptation, longing, and fear. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot stand beside a family watching grasslands fail beyond the valley. We cannot hear the first stories told about a vanished lake. We cannot know whether elders spoke with grief about places that no longer sustained life. We cannot name the moment when the desert ceased to be home for some and became wilderness for their descendants. Climate leaves traces and sediments, pollen, lake beds, dust, and isotopes. But the human sorrow of environmental change is harder to recover. Yet the broad pattern remains powerful. As the world dried, the Nile gathered meaning. As the desert expanded, the river became more sacred. As habitable land narrowed, organization intensified. As resources concentrated, authority sharpened. As death entered the dry margins, preservation became possible. As people lived between black land and red land, they learned to imagine existence as a struggle between fertility and desolation, order and danger, return and disappearance. Egypt did not simply rise beside a river. It rose at the meeting point of water and thirst. It was forged where dark mud touched red stone, where people stood between abundance and annihilation, where the flood promised renewal, and the desert reminded every living soul that nothing was guaranteed. And from that stark geography came one of the most enduring visions in human history, a civilization that would spend thousands of years trying to hold the black land against the red. The first sacred symbols of Egypt did not arrive in the silence of temples. They appeared in clay, bone, ivory, pigment, stone, animal gesture, body paint, masked ceremony, and the charged images that moved through pre-dynastic life like sparks in dry grass. They were not yet organized into the grand theology that later filled tomb walls and temple courts. They did not yet stand beneath long hymns or priestly liturgies. They lived closer to the ground, closer to bodies, closer to animals, closer to the uncertain line between the seen world and the unseen forces that seemed to press against it. In this early symbolic world, nothing had to be merely itself. A bull was not only meat and hide, it was strength, fertility, danger, possession, and force made visible. A falcon was not only a bird, it was height, speed, vision, and the terrifying grace of a hunter descending from the sky. A crocodile was not only an animal in the river, it was ambush, death, water, patience, and power hidden beneath a calm surface. A scorpion was not only a creature of the desert floor, it was venom, warning, sudden pain, and survival in the red land. These beings were teachers. They revealed forms of power humans could admire, fear, imitate, and perhaps attempt to command. The people of pre-dynastic Egypt lived surrounded by animal intelligence. They watched birds migrate and nest in marshes. They watched cattle move in heavy, breathing bodies through dust and grass. They watched predators take prey. They watched snakes vanish into holes and crocodiles disappear beneath water without a ripple. They knew that animals possessed abilities human beings did not. Sharper sight, greater strength, hidden movement, natural weapons, knowledge of places inaccessible to ordinary human life. It is not difficult to imagine how such creatures became more than resources. They became signs, undecorated pottery. Animals emerge from curved lines and painted fields. On small objects, they appear in simplified yet powerful forms. On palettes used for grinding pigments, animal outlines take shape in stone. Some creatures may have marked groups, clans, leaders, ceremonies, or mythic ideas. Others may have belonged to rituals whose meaning has been lost. Archaeology can show that an image was repeated. It can show where the object was found. It can compare forms across sites and periods, but the final meanings remain elusive, hovering beyond certainty. Still, repetition matters. When certain animals are shown again and again, they are not decorative accidents. They belong to a shared language of power. The later Egyptian divine world, crowded with animal-headed gods and sacred beasts, did not spring from nothing. It grew from deep habits of seeing. Pre-dynastic people had already learned to think through animals. They had already recognized that the natural world could carry human questions about death, fertility, danger, authority, and transformation. The human body itself also became a surface of meaning. Cosmetic palettes suggest that pigments were ground and applied, perhaps to faces, skin, hair, or ritual objects. Green minerals, black substances, red ochre, and other colors may have served many purposes at once. Protection from glare or insects, decoration, identity, healing, beauty, rank, magic, ceremony. In ancient societies, these categories are rarely separate. To paint the body could be practical, social, and sacred in a single act. A face marked with pigment is no longer only a face. It becomes a sign others must read. Masks may have played a role in this world, though surviving evidence is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. The idea of masked performance, of humans temporarily taking on the appearance of animals, spirits, ancestors, or powers, fits deeply with the symbolic atmosphere of early Egypt. A mask changes the wearer. It hides the individual and reveals something larger. In firelight, at the edge of settlement or cemetery, among drums, voices, dust, and smoke, a masked figure could become more than human for those who watched. Such performances leave almost nothing behind. A woven costume decays. A painted skin vanishes. A chant dies in the throat. A dance disappears the moment it is completed. Archaeology often recovers the durable remains of events whose emotional force was carried by perishable things. A small figurine, a carved animal, a palette, a painted vessel, an unusual burial. These may be the last traces of ceremonies once vivid enough to reorder a community's sense of the world. Boats, too, became sacred symbols very early. Painted vessels show long craft with cabins, standards, and sometimes rows of oars. The Nile made boats practical, of course. They carried people, goods, animals, messages, and prestige objects through the green corridor of Egypt. But in symbolic life, the boat becomes much more. It is a shape of passage. It crosses water. It links places. It carries the living, the dead, and perhaps the invisible. A boat can move between villages, but it can also move between states of being. In later Egypt, divine boats would carry gods through the sky and through the underworld. Sacred barks would appear in procession. The dead king would travel through cosmic waters. The roots of these ideas may lie in a pre-dynastic imagination already familiar with the boat as a vessel of transformation. To paint a boat on a funerary pot may have been to evoke travel beyond ordinary geography, or it may have recalled ceremony, trade, elite display, mythic journey, or all of these at once. The earliest standards are equally mysterious. On pottery and ceremonial objects, pole-like signs appear with shapes or emblems at their tops. Later, Egypt would use standards to represent gods, regions, military units, and sacred identities. In the pre-dynastic world, these signs may already have marked communities, divine powers, ritual groups, or leaders. A standard does something remarkable. It lifts an image above human height. It makes a symbol visible from a distance. It allows people to gather beneath a sign. To gather beneath a sign is to become more than a crowd. It is to become a people. This may be one of the quiet revolutions of pre-dynastic Egypt. Symbols began to organize human belonging. A community could be known by an animal, a place, a banner, a burial custom, a pottery style, or a ritual object. Identity became visible. Authority could borrow the force of symbols and display itself in ceremonies where everyone saw who carried the emblem, who stood near it, who touched it, and who was excluded from it. Sacred symbols are never innocent in societies moving toward hierarchy. They bind, but they also separate. They include some and mark others as outside. They make leadership appear natural by linking human authority to animal strength, ancestral power, cosmic order, or dangerous forces. A chief associated with a bull does not merely own cattle. He borrows the bull's force. A leader connected with a falcon does not merely rule from a settlement. He claims the height of the sky. A ritual specialist who handles pigments, masks, bones, or animal images may be seen as someone able to cross boundaries. Others fear. Here, religion and politics begin to lean toward one another, not as institutions with clear walls, but as overlapping forms of influence. Those who controlled ceremonies may have controlled memory. Those who controlled rare symbols may have controlled identity. Those who staged public rituals may have shaped emotion, loyalty, fear, and awe. Long before royal theology declared the king divine, the materials of sacred kingship were being gathered from animals, ancestors, standards, painted bodies, boats, and burial rites. This is why the earliest sacred symbols matter so profoundly. They show the mind of Egypt forming, not yet fully written, not yet systematized, not yet fixed into the majestic forms of later art, but already searching for a visual language capable of holding the world together. River and desert, living and dead, human and animal, leader and follower, body and spirit, journey and return, violence and fertility, fear and order. The symbols did not explain the world in the way modern science explains it. They made the world inhabitable. They gave shape to forces too large for ordinary speech. They allowed communities to handle danger through image, ceremony, and repetition. They allowed people to stand in the presence of death and imagine passage. They allowed animals to become more than prey or threat. They allowed leaders to become more than strong individuals. They allowed memory to survive in visible form. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the prayers whispered over pigments. We do not know whether a painted boat was mourned over, celebrated, feared, or sung into meaning. We do not know the names of the animal powers that filled these early minds. We do not know which images belong to children's stories, which to elite ceremonies, which to funerals, which to warfare, which to feasting, and which to things more private than archaeology can ever reach. But we can see that pre-dynastic Egypt was not waiting for religion to be invented. It was already alive with sacred imagination. Its people looked at the world and saw power everywhere, in horns, in wings, in teeth, in venom, in water, in color, in the journey of a boat, in the raised emblem of a standard, in the body prepared for burial, in the desert edge where the dead remained, in the flood that returned when all seemed lost. And from these images, slowly, patiently, mysteriously, Egypt began to speak in the language that would make it immortal. Trade roads through the wastes were not roads as we imagined them. They were not paved lines across the earth, not marked by milestones, not guarded by stations with written orders and royal seals. They were memories crossing dangerous ground. They were chains of waterholes, mountain passes, dry valleys, rock shelters, familiar horizons, and stories of where to turn when the desert began to erase all confidence. They were carried in the minds of travelers, herders, hunters, prospectors, and merchants who understood that distance itself could become a form of wealth. In pre-dynastic Egypt, the Nile gave life, but the desert gave rarity. And rarity has always stirred desire. Along the river, clay, reeds, fish, cattle, grain, and fertile mud could sustain communities. Yet the objects that marked distinction often came from beyond the immediate world of settlement: hard stones, green minerals, red ochre, gold, shells, ivory, obsidian, exotic animal products, fine flint, materials whose very presence in a grave or elite dwelling spoke of movement, connection, and access to places many people would never see. To possess such things was to possess distance. A shell from far away was not merely a shell. It was the sea made small enough to wear. A bead of rare stone was not merely an ornament. It was desert, labor, and danger transformed into beauty. A piece of obsidian was not merely volcanic glass. It was a black mirror of remote geology, carried through exchange networks that joined separate worlds. Gold was not merely metal. It was sunlight caught in the earth, incorruptible, gleaming, and perhaps already burdened with meanings that would later make it the flesh of gods. These objects moved through hands, and each hand added value. Some goods may have traveled by direct expedition. Others may have passed from group to group, across regions, through gift exchange, marriage alliances, seasonal gatherings, ritual meetings, and informal trade. The modern word trade can sometimes make these exchanges sound cold and commercial, as if people were merely calculating profit. But in early societies, exchange often did more than move goods. It created relationships. It settled obligations. It displayed generosity. It bound families. It marked alliances. It made distant people imaginable. A rare object could carry a story with it. Who found it? Who gave it? Who risked the journey? Who was worthy to receive it? Who had the authority to distribute it? Who was buried with it when life ended? In this way, trade became memory, and memory became power. The desert routes required courage and knowledge. A journey away from the river was never casual. Heat could kill. Thirst could kill. Disorientation could kill. Animals, injury, conflict, and exhaustion all waited beyond the green corridor. Those who moved successfully through the wastes possessed expertise that must have commanded respect. They knew the stars. They knew the shapes of hills. They knew where shade might be found. They knew how much water could be carried and when it had to be conserved. They knew the difference between a dry channel that led nowhere and one that opened toward stone, pigment, or pasture. Such knowledge could be inherited, guarded, traded, or ritualized. It is possible that some people became specialists in distance, men and women whose authority came not from fields, but from movement, guides, caravan leaders, prospectors, hunters, desert herders, and messengers may have occupied a special place in early communities. They brought back materials, information, rumors, and perhaps stories of strange lands. They connected the village to the horizon. They made the unknown useful. At the edge of the Nile, these travelers may have been figures of awe, dust-covered, sun-darkened, carrying stones, shells, pigments, hides, or news. They returned from places where ordinary farmers did not go. In their hands, the red land entered the black land. In their stories, the world expanded. The movement of goods also changed craft production. Rare materials invited skilled hands. Ivory could be carved. Stone could be ground, polished, drilled, and shaped. Shells could become beads. Pigments could be prepared for bodies, objects, and ceremonies. Fine flint could become blades whose elegance surpassed simple function. Gold, even in early forms, could be hammered, shaped, and made to shine in ways that set the wearer apart. Craft specialists were not merely workers, they were transformers. They took the raw substance of distant places and turned it into objects of identity, status, ritual, and beauty. Their skill gave material form to power. A leader might control access to exotic materials, but without artisans, rarity remained raw. Through craft, distance became display. This is one of the quiet revolutions of the pre-dynastic world. A society once organized around local survival began to value things whose meanings depended on non-local origins. The village was no longer enough. The cemetery was no longer filled only with what the immediate landscape could provide. Objects began to point outward. A grave in the Nile Valley could contain a whisper of the Red Sea, a glimmer from desert mountains, a memory of Nubia, a trace of the Levant, or a substance shaped by roots no single person fully controlled. The world was widening, and with widening came competition. Who controlled the route to a stone source? Who knew where gold could be found? Who maintained relations with desert groups? Who could secure shells, ivory, oils, resins, or unusual minerals? Who had the influence to gather skilled artisans around these materials? The answers to such questions may have helped produce new ranks within society. Power does not always begin with armies. Sometimes it begins with access to water, access to routes, access to rare goods, access to makers, access to sacred meaning. An elite person buried with exotic objects did not merely display wealth. The burial proclaimed that this individual, or this individual's family, had connections beyond ordinary reach. The grave became a map of influence. The body lay still, but the objects around it spoke of movement across deserts, rivers, seas, and social boundaries. Trade also carried images, foreign motifs, unfamiliar shapes, and new ideas could travel alongside materials. A vessel formed from one region might inspire imitation in another. A symbol seen on an object might be adapted to local belief. A technique learned through contact might be transformed into something distinctly Egyptian. Cultural borrowing is rarely simple copying. People select, reinterpret, and embed foreign things into their own worlds. What arrives from outside becomes powerful, precisely because it is made local. In pre-dynastic Egypt, contact with neighboring regions may have helped stimulate innovation in administration, iconography, craft, and elite display. Yet Egypt did not merely receive influence passively. It absorbed, altered, and intensified what it encountered. The Nile Valley had its own deep traditions, its own symbolic grammar, its own ecological pressures. Imported objects entered a landscape already charged with meaning. A foreign stone could become Egyptian through burial. A distant shell could become an ancestral ornament. An image from elsewhere could be remade into a sign of local power. This is how civilizations grow, not as sealed containers, but as living systems of exchange, memory, and adaptation. The Nile itself was the great internal highway. Boats carried goods along its current and against it with labor, sail, rope, and patience. Settlements separated by days or weeks of travel could remain in contact. Ideas moved more easily along water than across dry land. A prestige object from the south could appear far downstream. A style from one cemetery could influence another. A powerful center could extend its presence not only through force, but through circulation. To move goods was to move influence, and influence, once moving, could become political. Feasts may have been crucial in this process. Rare goods arriving from distant places could be displayed during ceremonies, exchanged among important families, or buried with selected individuals. Food, beer, meat, music, performance, and exotic materials together created events that people remembered. A leader who brought the world to the village, who placed rare things before others, who transformed distant danger into local abundance, could seem larger than ordinary life. Such gatherings may have turned trade into spectacle. Imagine a ceremony near the Nile's edge, cattle lowing in the dusk, fires kindled, beer poured into vessels, bodies painted, visitors arriving from other settlements, a rare stone blade passed between hands, shell ornaments shining against skin, a leader seated near objects whose origins lie beyond the horizon, a standard raised, the crowd watching, the rare and the sacred merging in the same breath. In such moments, economy, religion, and politics were not separate forces. They were one performance. The desert routes also carried danger into society. Competition for valuable materials could lead to conflict. Travelers might be attacked. Expeditions might fail. Groups controlling strategic passages could demand gifts or tribute. Raiding, rivalry, and revenge may have accompanied exchange. The same routes that brought shells and stones could bring enemies, disease, rumors, and ambition. Distance enlarges imagination, but it also enlarges fear. The unknown land beyond the settlement could be desired and dreaded at once. This double feeling may have strengthened the sacred aura of exotic goods. They came from dangerous places. They survived the journey. They crossed boundaries. They were touched by risk. To wear them, hold them, bury them, or offer them was to domesticate danger. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names of the travelers who first mapped these desert paths in memory. We do not know the bargains spoken beside waterholes. We do not know whether goods were exchanged with laughter, suspicion, formal ritual, or silent caution. We do not know how many lives were lost carrying small objects that would one day rest in graves and museum cases. We do not know what stories were told about the sea by those who had never seen it but wore its shells. Yet the archaeological pattern speaks with quiet force. Pre-dynastic Egypt was not an isolated river world sealed from the rest of humanity. It was connected. It reached outward. It drew the desert, the sea, the south, the north, and distant lands into its growing cultural body. Every rare object found in the earth is a trace of movement. Every imported material is a fossil of relationship. Every crafted ornament is a meeting point between landscape, labor, desire, and identity. Through trade, Egypt learned to gather the world through routes across the wastes. Local leaders became regional powers. Through rare materials, social difference became visible. Through exchange, symbols traveled farther than speech. Through danger, objects acquired aura. And through the long movement of shells, stones, pigments, metals, and memories, the Nile Valley became not merely a place of settlement, but a center toward which distant things were drawn. The trade roads have vanished beneath sand and time, but their consequences remain in graves, in workshops, in painted vessels, in polished beads, in the earliest signs of authority gathering around those who could command distance itself. Kings before kings moved through the pre-dynastic landscape like figures seen at the edge of firelight. They are there, but not yet fully named. Their power can be felt in graves, symbols, weapons, buildings, workshops, animal burials, and the gathering weight of certain places along the Nile. They do not yet stand before us with the full grandeur of later monarchy, wearing the double crown and claiming the eternal order of the cosmos. They are more elusive than that, more dangerous, perhaps less polished, closer to the raw moment when human leadership begins to separate itself from ordinary life and clothe itself in ritual, violence, ancestry, and awe. To search for them is to search for power before it learned to write its own history. Abydos and Hierakonpolis stand among the great centers of this shadowed world. Their names belong to later maps, later scholarship, later memory, but the places themselves were already charged with importance long before dynastic Egypt took shape. These were not random settlements among many. They became magnets of authority. People gathered there, worked there, buried the powerful there, performed rituals there, and left behind traces of a society beginning to organize itself around leaders of unusual status. At Hierakonpolis, the archaeology suggests scale, craft, ceremony, and hierarchy. There were areas of production, elite cemeteries, evidence for feasting, brewing, animal management, and perhaps rituals that involved dangerous creatures and impressive displays. This was a place where power could be staged, not simply held, but shown. The leader in such a center was not merely someone who possessed more goods. He was someone around whom labor, symbol, and spectacle could be arranged. Power must become visible if it is to endure in a world without newspapers, law codes, coins, or mass inscriptions. Authority had to be seen in bodies and events. It had to appear in the size of a grave, the rarity of grave goods, the skill of crafted objects, the number of animals slaughtered for a feast, the people who attended ceremonies, the standards raised above a crowd, the weapons carried, the pigments worn, and the stories repeated when the fire burned low. A chief became powerful not only by commanding resources, but by becoming memorable. Memory is one of the first kingdoms at Abydos, especially in the desert cemetery areas that would later become central to royal burial. The signs of emerging rulership become increasingly striking. Large tombs, rich offerings, imported goods, and administrative traces suggest individuals whose authority reached beyond household and village. These were rulers in formation, men whose families and followers invested great labor into death because their lives had already become politically meaningful. The tomb was no longer only a resting place. It was a statement of dominion. A large tomb requires planning. It requires labor. It requires materials. It requires people willing or compelled to work for the memory of one individual. That fact alone tells us that social power had reached a new intensity. Someone had become important enough for others to build death around him. Someone had become a center. In these tombs, the body of the ruler lay among goods that marked distance, wealth, ritual significance, and command. The grave became a miniature world, an ordered environment beneath the sand, designed to project authority beyond the moment of burial. The king before kings was perhaps first a master of relationships. He stood at the crossing point of kin groups, settlements, trade routes, craft specialists, ritual experts, warriors, and ancestors. His authority may have rested on his ability to gather people who did not normally live under one roof or one lineage. He may have controlled access to rare materials. He may have sponsored feasts. He may have organized conflict. He may have presided over burials, ceremonies, and seasonal gatherings. He may have claimed special connection to animal powers or celestial order. His person became a knot in the social fabric, and the more strands tied to him, the harder he was to remove. The rise of such figures was not inevitable. Many human societies resist concentration of power. They mock the boastful, redistribute goods, abandon arrogant leaders, or limit authority through custom. For hierarchy to grow, something must change. Surplus must accumulate. Warfare may intensify. Ritual may elevate certain lineages. Trade may enrich select families. Environmental pressure may make coordination more necessary. The dead may be used to justify the living. Over time, leadership becomes less temporary and more inherited, less situational and more sacred. A man who once led because he was useful becomes a ruler because his bloodline is said to matter. A grave that once honored a respected person becomes a monument to a dynasty. A symbol once carried in ceremony becomes an emblem of office. A weapon once used in conflict becomes a sign of legitimate force. This is the slow magic of political transformation. One of the clearest signs of emerging rulership lies in the fusion of violence and ritual. Ceremonial objects from late pre-dynastic Egypt show scenes of domination. Animals, enemies, processions, and powerful human figures. Some images seem to place one person at a scale or position greater than others. This is not merely art becoming more dramatic. It is authority learning a visual language. The ruler is shown as one who strikes, controls, orders, and stands above chaos. The act of smiting an enemy, so famous in later Egyptian kingship, has roots in this earlier world of image and force. A raised mace, a bound captive, a defeated rival, a ruler towering in composition. These are not simple records of individual battles. They are claims about reality. They declare that the leader protects the ordered community by defeating disorder. They make violence sacred by placing it inside a symbolic system. That is a dangerous and powerful invention. Once violence becomes ritualized, it can justify expansion. It can turn conquest into cosmic duty. It can make obedience feel like participation in order itself. The king before kings may have emerged not only as a war leader, but as the person whose violence was imagined as necessary, rightful, even holy. Through him, the community could see its enemies defeated and its fears given shape. But power also needed tenderness, generosity, and fertility. A ruler who only destroyed would not hold a society for long. He had to feed, redistribute, protect, host, and renew. Feasting may have been central to early authority because it turned stored wealth into shared experience. Meat, beer, grain, music, dance, pigment, rare objects, and ceremony created moments when people felt the abundance of a leader. To eat at his feast was to enter his world. To receive from his hand or from his household was to acknowledge his position. The earliest rulers were therefore performers of abundance and controllers of danger. They stood between famine and feast, between enemy and community, between ancestors and descendants, between wild animal power and human order, between the living settlement and the desert cemetery. Their authority was not abstract. It had to be enacted repeatedly, through gathering, giving, judging, fighting, burying, and remembering. Every ceremony reinforced the possibility that one person, one lineage, one center, could hold together forces that otherwise might tear society apart. Animals played a crucial role in this royal imagination. Bulls, falcons, scorpions, lions, and other powerful beings gathered around the visual language of pre-dynastic authority. A ruler associated with such creatures could borrow their qualities. The bull gave strength and fertility. The falcon gave height and vision. The scorpion gave venom and desert potency. The lion gave terror and command. These were not mascots in a modern sense. They were concentrated powers of the natural world, drawn into human politics. In this way, kingship became more than administration. It became transformation. The ruler was not simply a strong man. He became a symbolic body. He carried meanings larger than his own flesh. Around him, objects, animals, ancestors, weapons, graves, and rituals gathered. When he died, the burial did not end his power. It extended it. His tomb could become a place of memory, legitimacy, and perhaps continuing presence. His successors could point to him, descend from him, invoke him, and build upon the authority his grave preserved. This is how a lineage becomes history. This is how history becomes sacred. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the voices of these early rulers. We do not know whether they were loved, feared, mocked, praised, or resented. We do not know how they dressed in life, how they spoke to their followers, how disputes were settled in their courts, or whether their power reached gently through alliance or brutally through force. We do not know the names of many who shaped the path toward monarchy. Their identities survive only as silhouettes made from tombs, objects, bones, and signs. Yet those silhouettes are immense. They show that the pharaoh was not a sudden miracle. The divine king was built from older forms of leadership that had already learned to command labor, orchestrate ritual, gather wealth, control violence, manipulate symbols, and dominate memory. The crown came late to a drama that had already been unfolding for centuries. Before the pharaoh, there was the chief whose grave outgrew the graves of others. Before the palace, there was the powerful settlement drawing craft and ceremony into itself. Before royal inscription, there was the image of domination. Before the state, there was the leader who made people believe that his body stood closer to order than theirs. Kings before kings did not yet rule Egypt as later kings would rule it, but they made kingship imaginable. They taught communities to see hierarchy as sacred, power as visible, violence as ordered, ancestry as political, and leadership as something that could survive death. In their graves and symbols, the first royal shadow stretches across the Nile. Long before the full figure steps into history, violence before the kingdom is not easy to see. It does not always leave behind fortresses with high walls, burned palaces, or fields of fallen soldiers. It often survives in smaller, colder signs: a skull fractured and healed, a skeleton buried with an embedded point, a weapon placed beside the dead, a settlement positioned defensively, a ceremonial image of captives, binding, striking, and domination. A cemetery where some bodies speak of trauma, while others lie surrounded by symbols of command. In pre-dynastic Egypt, conflict did not begin with armies marching beneath royal banners. It began in the tensions of a narrowing world. The Nile was generous, but it was not infinite. The black soil could feed communities, but only within limits set by flood, labor, storage, and control. Good land mattered. River access mattered. Pasture mattered. Fishing places mattered. Routes through the desert mattered. The power to obtain rare materials mattered. As communities grew and social ranks sharpened, competition likely became more intense. The same river that connected people also placed them in one another's path. Conflict may have taken many forms. Not all violence is war. There may have been raids for cattle, revenge attacks between kin groups, struggles over burial places, clashes between rival settlements, ambushes on desert routes, ritualized combat, domestic violence, elite executions, and public displays of punishment. Some violence may have been practical, some symbolic, some personal, some political, some remembered proudly, some hidden in shame. Archaeology can reveal injury, weapons, and destruction, but motive often remains answerless, adrift to ponder. Still, the evidence is enough to show that the road toward unification was not only paved with exchange and shared belief, it was also marked by force. Weapons from pre-dynastic contexts include maces, knives, arrowheads, and other implements capable of killing, though many tools could shift between hunting, craft, ritual, and violence depending on use. The mace is especially important. A heavy head fixed to a handle creates a brutal instrument, simple in concept, devastating in effect. Over time, the mace became one of the great symbols of authority. A ruler holding a mace is not shown as a farmer, herder, or trader. He's shown as someone who can strike. Ooh, that image matters. The raised weapon became a visual declaration that power had the right to destroy. A leader who smites a captive is not merely shown in action. He is shown transforming violence into order. The captive represents threat, enemy, outsider, rebel, rival, chaos, or all of these at once. The ruler's blow becomes more than a blow. It becomes an argument. It says that domination is necessary, that hierarchy protects the world, that enemies must be subdued so the community may endure. Such images did not arise from nowhere. They belong to societies in which competition, fear, and ambition had already become central to political life. When leaders claim to defeat chaos, they usually live in worlds where chaos feels near, floods fail, rival groups raid, trade routes are threatened, local chiefs compete for followers, settlements rise and fall, cemeteries display inequality. The powerful need stories explaining why their violence is not merely violence, but rightful action. This is one of the oldest tricks of kingship. It turns the wound into a ritual. It turns the victim into a symbol. It turns the strong man into a defender of cosmic balance. Long before professional armies marched in organized ranks, men could be mobilized for fighting. Communities could call upon kin, clients, allies, dependents, and retainers. A powerful chief might gather warriors through obligation, fear, reward, loyalty, feasting, or sacred duty. These were not necessarily soldiers in the later institutional sense. They were farmers, herders, hunters, craftsmen, and young men seeking prestige, revenge, plunder, protection, or belonging. Yet under certain conditions, such groups could become formidable. Violence also shapes identity. A community that fights another begins to define itself more sharply. We are not them. Our dead are not their dead. Our symbols are not their symbols. Our leader protects us from their danger. Conflict can harden boundaries that were once fluid. It can turn neighboring communities into enemies and local emblems into banners of opposition. In such a climate, powerful centers gain advantage if they can promise security. Protection is one of the foundations of rule. A leader who controls violence inside a community and directs it outward may become indispensable. People may surrender autonomy in exchange for safety, or be forced to do so by the very people claiming to protect them. Stored grain, livestock, women, children, craft specialists, rare materials, and sacred places all require defense in a competitive world. A household can defend little. A village can defend more. A chiefdom can mobilize many. A kingdom can turn violence into an institution. The movement from local conflict to political unification may have involved both conquest and absorption. Some communities may have been defeated outright. Others may have submitted through alliance, marriage, exchange, or ritual incorporation. Symbols of one region may have been taken up by another. Local elites may have kept status by serving stronger rulers. Resistance may have been crushed, negotiated, or transformed into loyalty through gifts and public ceremony. The archaeological record rarely gives a clean battlefield. Instead, it gives signs of pressure. Elite graves grow richer. Centers become larger. Images of domination become more common. Weapons become symbols of status. Administrative practices begin to appear. Local differences are gradually drawn into wider systems. The world narrows toward political consolidation. Violence was likely not constant everywhere, but the possibility of violence may have changed everything. Fear can organize a society as powerfully as belief. A village that has been raided remembers. A family that loses cattle remembers. A child who sees captives brought in remembers. A community that watches a rival leader humiliated or killed learns what strength looks like. Public violence creates memory in the bodies of the living. It teaches obedience. It warns enemies. It binds followers through shared danger and shared victory. Yet violence alone cannot create durable civilization. Pure terror burns too hot. It consumes loyalty and invites rebellion. Successful early rulers had to combine force with generosity, ritual, justice, ancestry, and abundance. They had to strike enemies, but also feed followers. They had to terrify outsiders, but reassure insiders. They had to place weapons beside symbols of fertility and renewal. They had to make people believe that power was not simply domination, but protection from a disorder worse than rule itself. This balance would become central to Egyptian kingship. The ruler as warrior, the ruler as provider, the ruler as ritual center, the ruler as guardian of order, the ruler as one who defeats enemies so life may continue. But in the pre-dynastic world, this ideology was still being forged. It was not yet polished into timeless formulas. It was raw, experimental, and perhaps deeply local. One chief's authority might rest on cattle wealth, another's on control of trade, another's on sacred objects, another's on victory in conflict. Over time, the most successful forms of power gathered together, and violence became inseparable from the image of legitimate rule. The human cost is easy to lose beneath grand historical language. Behind every symbol of conquest was a body, someone captured, someone struck, someone displaced, someone buried, someone forced to serve a new center, someone whose local world was absorbed into a larger order, not of their choosing. The birth of the state is often narrated as progress, but from the ground level, it may have felt like loss, submission, fear, and the end of older freedoms. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know how many communities resisted the rising powers of Upper Egypt. We do not know the names of defeated chiefs. We do not know how many settlements vanished through violence rather than abandonment. We do not know whether songs of victory were sung over captives, or whether mothers mourned sons taken into raids whose causes are now dust. We do not know how much blood lies behind the first image of a ruler raising his weapon, but we can see that violence helped shape the path toward the kingdom. It sharpened hierarchy. It elevated war leaders. It made protection valuable. It turned weapons into symbols. It transformed enemies into political tools. It allowed powerful centers to expand their reach across the Nile Valley. And somewhere in that long, turbulent process, the figure of the ruler changed. He was no longer merely first among his people. He became the one who stood between the ordered world and everything threatening to tear it apart. Before the kingdom, violence was scattered, local, personal, and symbolic. Then it gathered, and when it gathered into the hands of rulers, Egypt moved closer to the age of crowns. Writing from silence did not begin with literature. It began with need. A jar had to be marked. A delivery had to be remembered. A grave good had to belong to someone. A storehouse had to know what had entered and what had left. A ruler had to send commands beyond the sound of his own voice. A workshop had to identify its products. A ceremony had to preserve names, titles, offerings, or authority in a form that would outlast the spoken word. This was one of the most profound transformations in human history, not because marks suddenly made people intelligent. They had always been intelligent. Not because speech was weak. Speech had carried memory, law, myth, kinship, and instruction for countless generations. But writing gave memory a body outside the human body. It allowed thought to harden on clay, bone, ivory, stone, and pottery. It allowed power to travel without the physical presence of the powerful. It allowed administration to reach across distance. It allowed identity to be fixed, repeated, and inspected. In pre-dynastic Egypt, the earliest signs do not appear as full sentences in the later sense. They appear as marks, labels, symbols, seal impressions, and brief notations, often tied to goods, ownership, quantities, places, or names. They belonged to a world where administration was becoming necessary because society had become too large, too unequal, and too connected to rely only on personal memory. A small tag can change the world. Imagine an ivory label attached to a container of oil, cloth, grain, or some rare substance. On its surface, tiny signs indicate a person, a place, a product, a quantity, a ritual event, or an institution. To modern eyes, it may seem humble, a little object, easily overlooked. Yet such a label reveals a society in which things had to be tracked. Goods were moving through organized channels. Someone needed to know where they came from, where they were going, who controlled them, and what meaning they carried. This is not writing as poetry. This is writing as control, and control is one of the bones of the state. Before a kingdom can endure, it must remember. It must remember offerings promised, tribute received, workers fed, goods stored, jars sealed, fields assessed, animals counted, and the names of those entitled to command or receive. Human memory alone is powerful, but it is also mortal, local, contestable, and vulnerable. A mark on an object can resist denial. A seal impression can testify that a container remained closed. A repeated sign can create a recognizable system. A name written down can become an anchor for authority. The seal is especially important. To seal a jar, bag, door, or container is to make a claim over access. It says that someone has the right to close this thing and to know whether it has been opened. A seal impression carries identity into material form. It can represent an individual, an office, a household, a ruler, or an institution. Once sealing becomes common, power is no longer only face-to-face. It becomes procedural. It leaves impressions, literally and politically. An unopened seal creates trust. A broken seal creates evidence. That is administration at its most ancient and elegant. The emergence of writing in Egypt was bound to elite power from the beginning. This was not a democratic technology spread equally through every household. It served those who gathered surplus, controlled labor, organized ritual, and ruled from growing centers. Writing allowed the powerful to extend themselves. Their names, titles, signs, and commands could appear on goods, tombs, offerings, and administrative objects. To mark something was to bring it within an ordered world. In a society moving toward kingship, writing did not merely record power, it helped create it. A ruler whose name could be inscribed possessed a new kind of presence. His identity could travel on labels. His authority could be attached to goods. His memory could enter the grave. His command could outlast his voice. A symbol associated with him could be repeated until it became recognizable beyond personal contact. The human ruler became an administrative sign, a ritual sign, and eventually a historical sign. This is where silence begins to break. Yet the earliest marks remain difficult. Scholars debate readings, functions, and sequences. Some signs may be true writing, representing language. Others may be symbolic notations, ownership marks, place signs, numerical systems, or administrative shorthand. The boundary between image and script was not sharp. A bird could be a bird, a sound, a deity, a title, an emblem, or a component in a name. A standard could indicate a group, a god, a place, or political identity. A mark could be both picture and word, both sign and symbol. That ambiguity is not failure. It is the birthplace of writing. In early Egypt, image and language grew together. The same visual imagination that filled pottery and ceremonial objects with animals, boats, standards, and powerful figures also provided the raw material for script. Writing did not appear in opposition to art. It emerged from a world already accustomed to thinking visually. The Egyptian sign would always remain unusually alive, both readable and visible, both linguistic and pictorial. A later hieroglyph could be beautiful and functional at once. That quality has deep roots. The first scribes, if we may call them that, must have held a special place. They were not merely clerks in the dull modern sense. They were guardians of marks that others may not have fully understood. They learned forms, sequences, associations, and perhaps restricted knowledge. Their work connected goods, names, places, and authority. To write was to participate in the ordering of reality. To miswrite, forget, or falsify may have carried serious consequences. The hand that made a sign served power, but it also possessed power. There is mystery here. How did one learn these marks? Was instruction formal or domestic? Were early scribes attached to rulers, temples in embryonic form, elite households, storehouses, or burial administrations? Did they speak aloud as they marked objects? Did they keep mental lists of signs? Did they experiment, simplify, standardize, and correct one another? The archaeological evidence gives objects, not classrooms. It gives labels, not lessons. Still, every surviving sign implies training, repetition, and shared understanding. Writing also changed death. A grave without writing can still be rich in memory, but its meanings remain largely anonymous to strangers. A grave with a name begins to resist anonymity. Once names enter funerary space, the dead acquire a new form of survival. They are not only bodies, not only ancestors, not only recipients of goods, they become named beings. The written name can call the dead into presence. It can identify ownership. It can protect status. It can allow later people to speak across time with unsettling precision. This is one reason ancient Egypt became obsessed with names. To name was to preserve. To erase a name was to wound existence. The roots of that idea lie in the moment when signs first began to hold identity outside the living voice. Administration and eternity grew from the same impulse to make memory durable. A label tied to a jar and a name placed in a tomb may seem different, yet both fight forgetting. One serves storage. One serves the soul. One organizes goods. One organizes remembrance. But in ancient Egypt, storage, offering, ritual, and death were never fully separate. Goods moved into tombs. Offerings supported the dead. Royal authority controlled redistribution. The written sign stood at the meeting point of economy and belief. The birth of writing also transformed time. Without writing, time lives in memory, landscape, genealogy, and repeated ritual. With writing, events can be fixed in sequence. Names can be ordered. Reigns can be counted. Deliveries can be tallied. Anniversaries can be observed. The past becomes more governable. A ruler can claim continuity with predecessors. An institution can preserve precedent. A tomb can insist that a life mattered. This does not mean that writing made history truthful. Writing can lie. It can boast. It can erase. It can turn conquest into order and extraction into duty. But even lies reveal power. The ability to impose an official memory is one of the marks of the state. When Egypt began to write, it began not only to remember, but to choose what memory would look like. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We cannot hear the first person who understood that a mark could stand for a name. We cannot see the first mistake scraped away from a label. We cannot know whether the earliest signs inspired wonder, suspicion, boredom, fear, or pride among those who saw them. We do not know how many experimental systems vanished before durable forms endured. We do not know how many marks on broken pottery were once meaningful to everyone nearby, and are now mute to us, yet their silence is not empty. The earliest writing in Egypt reveals a society crossing a threshold. Power was becoming administrative. Memory was becoming material. Identity was becoming inscribed. Goods were entering systems of control. Names were beginning to survive the mouth that spoke them. The ruler, the official, the artisan, the offering, the storehouse, and the tomb were being drawn into a single web of signs. From that web, the Egyptian state would speak, not first in long hymns, not first in sacred books, but in marks scratched, painted, carved, pressed, and tied to the movement of things. Writing began with jars, labels, seals, and names, and in those small signs, the silence of prehistory began to crack open. Scorpion, Narmer, and the threshold stand in the half-light between archaeology and history. They are names, but also shadows. They are rulers, but also questions. They belong to a time when Egypt was becoming readable, yet not yet fully exposed to the clear glare of written record. Their world is one of carved symbols, ceremonial weapons, broken labels, buried tombs, painted signs, and images of power so forceful that they still seem to vibrate with ambition after more than 5,000 years. Here, the silence is no longer complete, but neither is it gone. The figures who stand near the opening of dynastic history are not known to us in the way later kings are known. We do not have long autobiographies explaining their campaigns. We do not have complete court archives. We do not possess their own voices in any ordinary human sense. What remains are fragments, and yet those fragments are astonishing. They show rulers already operating within a visual and political language of conquest, ritual, territory, divine association, and monumental memory. Scorpion is one such figure. The name itself may come from a sign, a creature of venom and desert power, carved or depicted in connection with rulership, whether every object assigned to him belongs to one man, one title, one emblem, or more than one person remains debated. The uncertainty is part of the fascination. The scorpion sign seems to belong to a world where royal identity was still forming, where name, animal, symbol, office, and myth could overlap. To modern minds, a name is usually a label. In this older world, a name could also be a force. A scorpion is small but feared. It survives in harsh places. It strikes with sudden pain. It carries poison in a curved tail raised above its body like a warning to the world. For a ruler at the edge of Egypt's birth, such an emblem would not be accidental. It spoke the language of danger controlled and danger inflicted. It joined the ruler to the Red Land, to hidden force, to the ability to wound enemies and survive where others faltered. The animal sign became political theology in miniature. One of the great ceremonial objects associated with this era shows a ruler wearing a tall crown, holding a hoe, standing near signs, attendants, and imagery that may evoke irrigation, foundation, agricultural ceremony, or royal action upon the land. Whether the scene records an actual event or an ideal ritual matters less than the claim it makes. The ruler is not merely fighting. He is opening, ordering, cutting into earth, directing fertility, making the land productive through sacred gesture. This is kingship becoming cosmic. The weapon and the farming tool belong together. The ruler destroys enemies and opens fields. He commands violence and fertility. He stands above others not only because he can strike, but because his action is imagined to bring life. In such images, the future ideology of Egypt appears in embryo. The ruler is already being shown as the one through whom the land is ordered. Narmer stands even more clearly at the threshold. His name is bound to one of the most famous objects ever recovered from ancient Egypt, a ceremonial palette carved with scenes of domination, procession, enemies, standards, and crowns. It is a thing of stone, but it behaves like a proclamation. On it, the ruler appears large, controlled, and terrible. He holds an enemy by the hair. His arm is raised. The body of the captive bends helplessly before him. Nearby, symbols speak in compressed visual language, and attendants follow within a world organized around royal presence. This is not merely an image of a man hurting another man. It is an image of political reality being made. Narmer's body is larger than ordinary bodies. His gesture is formal, not chaotic. The enemy is not a person in the full visual sense. He has become a type, a sign of disorder. The ruler's violence is not presented as rage. It is presented as necessary order. The palette does not ask us to pity the captive. It asks us to recognize the king. Such images are difficult for modern viewers because they are beautiful and brutal at once. The carving is elegant. The composition is careful. The symbolism is rich, yet its message is domination. That tension lies at the heart of early state formation. Civilization produces art, administration, ritual, and architecture, but it also produces new scales of coercion. The threshold of history is not a gentle doorway. It is guarded by a king with a raised weapon. On another register of royal imagery, defeated enemies lie in rows, their bodies arranged as evidence of victory. Standards and attendants appear. Animals with intertwined necks may symbolize control, union, or the taming of chaotic forces. The ruler wears crowns associated with different regions, suggesting a claim over a wider land. Whether the object commemorates a single final unification or represents an ideology of rule already developing across generations remains answerless. Adrift to ponder, but the claim is unmistakable. The king rules more than one place. The king defeats enemies. The king gathers symbols under his body. The king is the center through which diversity becomes order. This is the threshold between local power and territorial kingship. The crowns themselves carry enormous meaning. A crown is never only a hat. It is a portable landscape. It condenses place, identity, authority, and sacred inheritance into an object worn on the head. When a ruler is shown wearing one crown, he belongs to a region and a tradition. When he is shown associated with more than one, he claims the power to hold opposites together. The later idea of two lands, joined under one ruler, is already pressing toward form. Yet the threshold was not only symbolic, it was administrative. The rulers of this period needed more than imagery. They needed systems capable of moving goods, commanding labor, collecting produce, marking ownership, sealing containers, organizing burials, and sustaining elite households. Tombs associated with early rulers show not just personal wealth, but institutional capacity. Goods arrive from different places. Labels mark commodities. Seals regulate access. Craft specialists produce objects for elite use. The king is becoming the head of a machine that can remember, gather, store, and redistribute. This machine did not run on metal gears. It ran on people, scribes or sign makers, potters, brewers, stoneworkers, hunters, boatmen, farmers, herders, guards, messengers, ritual experts, tomb builders, servants, captives, families tied to royal estates, local elites brought into the orbit of a greater power. Every jar in a royal tomb implies labor. Every carved label implies administration. Every imported object implies connection. Every monumental grave implies command over time and bodies. The threshold ruler was therefore not only a warrior, he was a coordinator of complexity. This is why Scorpion and Narmer fascinate so deeply. They stand at the moment when the personal charisma of chiefs was hardening into the durable office of kingship. A strong leader can die and be forgotten. A king creates a structure that survives him. His name becomes part of an order. His tomb becomes a political monument. His successors inherit not merely his goods, but his position within a sacred and administrative universe. The person becomes an office, the office becomes divine, the divine becomes the state. At this threshold, the dead ruler also gained new force. Royal burial was no longer only remembrance, it was continuity. The tomb preserved legitimacy. It allowed successors to root their authority in a chain of powerful ancestors. A cemetery of rulers could become a sacred landscape of political descent. To bury kings together was to build time into the earth, generation after generation, until the desert itself seemed to testify that rule had always belonged to this line. And yet, one must not imagine that everyone agreed. The making of a kingdom must have created winners and losers. Local rulers were absorbed, defeated, married into new systems, or erased. Communities that once lived by their own traditions found themselves drawn into larger patterns of taxation, labor, military obligation, and ritual dependence. The symbols of unity that look magnificent on ceremonial objects may have been experienced by some as conquest. One person's order can be another person's submission. This is the paradox at the threshold. The birth of Egypt is glorious. The birth of Egypt is violent. The birth of Egypt is administrative. The birth of Egypt is sacred. The birth of Egypt is human. Scorpion and Narmer are not simply heroic founders in a clean story of progress. They are figures of transformation, standing where older worlds were being gathered, compressed, and sometimes crushed into a new political form. They belong to a generation of rulers who understood, or whose courts understood, that power needed images capable of overwhelming memory. They did not merely rule, They staged rule. They carved it into objects. They placed it in tombs. They made domination beautiful enough to endure. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know Narmer's voice. We do not know whether Scorpion was feared more than loved, or loved more than feared. We do not know the names of those who carved their signs, brewed their beer, carried their standards, died in their wars, or filled their tombs with offerings. We do not know which battles were real events and which were ritual statements. We do not know how much of unification happened through force, marriage, intimidation, administration, belief, or the slow exhaustion of alternatives. But the threshold remains. On one side, a land of competing centers, rising chiefs, sacred animals, elite graves, and expanding symbols. On the threshold itself, rulers whose names begin to harden into history. Scorpion, armor, figures not fully visible, yet impossible to ignore. They stand at the doorway of dynastic Egypt with weapons raised, crowns shining, captives subdued, signs gathering around them, and the long machinery of kingship beginning to turn. In their images, one can almost hear the first sound of the state, not as a spoken sentence, but as a carved command. Look, remember, obey. The birth of the two lands was not simply the drawing of a line around Egypt, it was the making of a sacred geography. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were not only regions on a map, they were landscapes of different moods, different rhythms, different resources, and different memories. To the south, the Nile ran through a narrow valley, pressed between desert cliffs, its settlements strung along the river like beads on a cord. To the north, the river opened into the delta, a maze of channels, marshes, islands, papyrus thickets, birds, fish, and fertile expanses reaching toward the sea. One land was linear and enclosed. The other was broad and branching. One looked toward desert routes and southern connections. The other looked toward wetlands, the Mediterranean, and the many mouths of the river. To rule both was not merely to control territory. It was to claim mastery over contrast. The idea of two lands became one of the most enduring concepts in Egyptian kingship. It gave political unity a cosmic shape. The ruler did not simply govern towns, fields, and people. He joined opposites. He held together valley and delta, south and north, narrow river and spreading marsh, desert edge and sea-facing lowland. In his body, the land became whole. In his crowns, geography became authority. In ritual, conquest became balance. This is one of the great achievements of early Egypt. It turned political expansion into sacred order. The process by which this union took place was surely complex. It was not a single clean moment when every village suddenly bowed to one throne. No human society changes so neatly. There must have been campaigns, alliances, negotiations, marriages, submissions, rivalries, local accommodations, and perhaps generations of pressure. Some communities may have been conquered. Others may have chosen cooperation with the rising power because resistance seemed dangerous or unprofitable. Local elites may have been absorbed into a larger system, keeping influence by serving the new order. Sacred symbols from different places may have been joined rather than erased. Unity, in such a world, was not only military, it was theatrical. It had to be shown again and again. The king had to appear as the one who bound the lands. Ceremonies likely repeated the act of joining, renewing it before gods, ancestors, officials, and people. Crowns, standards, thrones, names, processions, and offerings all helped make unity visible. A kingdom exists in fields and storehouses, yes, but it also exists in imagination. People must be taught to see many landscapes as one land, many communities as one order, many obligations as one structure of rule. The double crown, formed from the symbols of north and south, became one of the clearest expressions of this idea. Worn together, the crowns announced that the ruler had taken into himself what the land held apart. It was not a quiet symbol. It was bold, almost impossible to miss. The king's head became the meeting place of Egypt. Every public appearance in such regalia turned the body into a map. A crown can make geography kneel. Yet the new kingdom needed more than symbols. It needed administration. A united Egypt required systems of collection, storage, transport, labor, and communication. Grain had to move. Goods had to be counted. Officials had to represent royal interests away from the ruler's immediate presence. Seals and labels had to mark property. Boats had to carry produce, people, stone, timber, and commands. Local communities had to be tied to central authority through obligation and ritual. The Nile made this possible in a way few landscapes could. It was both lifeline and highway. The current carried boats northward. Winds could help push sails southward. Settlements along the river could be reached in sequence. Goods could be gathered and redistributed along a natural corridor. The river did not make rule easy, but it made large-scale coordination imaginable. In the delta, where channels spread and marshes complicated movement, control may have required different strategies. The king's power had to adapt to water, mud, reeds, and local networks. The union of the two lands therefore required practical intelligence. Officials had to know local conditions. Storehouses had to function. Taxes or contributions had to be extracted without destroying the communities that produced them. Labor had to be summoned for royal projects, military needs, transport, craft production, and funerary construction. The king's authority could not rest only on awe. It had to feed itself. This is where the early state becomes visible as a daily reality. A farmer may not have seen the king, but he may have felt the king in grain demands. A potter may not have heard a royal command, but she may have made jars for royal storage. A boatman may not have understood cosmic ideology, but he may have carried goods under seal. A local leader may have kept his status, but now, as part of a wider hierarchy, a ritual specialist may have served old powers. But increasingly, under the shadow of royal order, unification reached into ordinary life. It reorganized labor, obligation, and memory. It changed what communities owed and to whom. It made some places more important and others subordinate. It created paths for ambitious local elites to rise within a larger system while closing older forms of independence. It brought greater coordination and perhaps greater security, but also heavier demands. The state is never only an idea. It is hands carrying baskets. It is backs bent under loads. It is grain counted in storage. It is people leaving home to work on projects chosen by others. The birth of the two lands was also the birth of a new political imagination of order. Later, Egyptians would speak of right arrangement, balance, truth, and cosmic stability, as if the world depended on them. The king's duty was to maintain order against disorder. In the context of unification, this ideology had immense power. Regional diversity could be framed as something needing royal harmony. Rebellion could be framed as chaos. Foreign lands could be framed as danger beyond the ordered world. The king's authority became not merely administrative, but existential. To obey was to participate in order. To resist was to threaten the balance of creation. This is how kingship deepens beyond force. A ruler who only commands bodies is powerful. A ruler who commands the imagination is stronger. By presenting Egypt as two lands joined through sacred kingship, early rulers created a framework that could survive individual reigns. Every king inherited the task of joining what was divided. Every coronation could renew the union. Every royal name could fit into a structure older than the man who bore it. The making of the two lands also required the management of local gods and sacred traditions. Egypt was never religiously uniform in a simple sense. Different regions possessed different divine associations, animal powers, shrines, emblems, and ancestral customs. A successful kingship could not erase all of them. It had to gather them. Local gods could become part of a wider religious landscape. Regional symbols could be placed within royal ideology. Sacred diversity could be arranged into hierarchy, just as political diversity was arranged into administration. This was a brilliant solution. The state did not need every place to forget itself. It needed every place to see itself inside Egypt. A local emblem could remain meaningful while also serving the king. A regional deity could keep its identity while receiving royal attention. A festival could preserve local memory while displaying loyalty to the larger order. The two lands were not made by flattening difference entirely. They were made by binding difference into a royal frame, and yet the cost must have been real. Some traditions were surely diminished. Some local powers were absorbed against their will. Some communities became peripheral. Some stories were never carved into official memory. The grand narrative of unity always leaves shadows at its edges. In those shadows are the people whose gods were quieted, whose chiefs were replaced, whose labor was taken, whose names did not enter the record. Still, the achievement remains immense. A long river valley and a complex delta were brought under a single vision of rule. Symbols, ceremonies, officials, storehouses, roots, graves, and crowns all worked together to create one of the most durable political identities in human history. Egypt became not merely a place, but an ordered world. Its ruler became not merely a man, but the living knot tying land, people, gods, ancestors, and cosmic balance together. The two lands were born from mud and marsh, desert and flood, conquest and compromise, ritual and record, terror and splendor. They were born when human beings learned to make geography sacred. They were born when a crown became a map. They were born when the Nile Valley and the Delta were imagined as partners in a single destiny. And from that union came the Egypt that would astonish the world, not because it appeared from nowhere, but because so many older forces had finally been gathered into one shining and terrible form. What was lost in becoming Egypt is harder to see than what was gained. The gains stand in stone. They shine in gold. They tower above desert plateaus and fill museum halls with the astonishing confidence of a civilization that learned how to make itself unforgettable. Kingship gave Egypt a center. Administration gave it reach. Ritual gave it continuity. Writing gave it memory. Monumental building gave it a body vast enough to challenge time. The union of the land made possible temples, tombs, expeditions, storehouses, state ceremonies, royal art, and the long tradition that still holds the imagination of the world. But every act of becoming is also an act of leaving something behind. When many local worlds were drawn into one kingdom, the older pattern of life did not simply continue unchanged beneath a royal crown. Villages, clans, cemeteries, regional cults, craft traditions, and local leaders had existed within networks of memory older than the state. Some of those traditions were absorbed, some were elevated, some were transformed into official symbols, some were pushed to the margins. Some disappeared so completely that archaeology can only detect their absence as a kind of silence. The birth of Egypt was also the narrowing of possibility. In a village world, power may have been personal, negotiated, seasonal, ritual, or distributed among different forms of knowledge. An elder might guide memory. A herder might command wealth in cattle. A craft specialist might possess rare skill. A healer might know plants, bodies, and dangerous words. A ritual figure might speak with ancestors. A successful hunter or warrior might gather prestige. Authority could gather in many hands, shifting according to circumstance. The state preferred hierarchy. It did not eliminate every local influence, but it placed them beneath a greater order. The king stood above all. Officials stood beneath him. Local elites became servants of the wider system, or rivals to be removed. Labor became more organized. Grain became more countable. Land became more taxable. People became more legible to power. What had once been obligation within a community could become obligation to an institution. That transformation must have been profound. A farmer might still plant, harvest, repair tools, feed children, honor ancestors, and fear the river's uncertainty. Yet the meaning of his labor changed when part of his surplus belonged not only to kin, village, or local ceremony, but to a royal system that reached far beyond his sight. A potter might still shape clay with inherited skill. Yet her vessels could now serve storehouses, offerings, taxation, or elite exchange. A boatman might still read the river, but his journeys could serve officials, sealed goods, or royal projects. The old tasks continued, but they entered a new web of command. The state did not merely rule land, it reorganized time. Seasons that once belonged to flood, family, herd, field, and local ritual became tied to larger schedules of collection, labor duty, ceremonial obligation, and royal demand. Human days could be summoned into projects no village alone would have chosen: the building of tombs, the movement of stone, the provisioning of workers, the preparation of royal burials, the maintenance of elite households. All of this required time taken from countless ordinary lives. Monuments are built from days. Each stone has a human hour beneath it. Each royal object carries invisible labor. Each great tomb is also a record of people whose names were not preserved. It is tempting to speak of civilization as an ascent, and in some ways it was. The state could organize food, move resources, defend territory, standardize systems, preserve memory, and create works of astonishing beauty. But from the ground, ascent may have felt like weight. The rising pyramid of power pressed downward as it rose upward. The more magnificent the king became, the smaller, ordinary people could appear within official vision. In pre-dynastic graves, one sees individuals wrapped in local meaning, accompanied by objects chosen within community traditions. In the royal state, the dead still mattered, but funerary culture increasingly reflected rank within a vast hierarchy. The afterlife itself became organized through status, wealth, access to ritual knowledge, and proximity to institutions capable of preserving names and bodies. Eternity, like land, could become unequal. What happened to the older ancestors, the small cemeteries on desert margins, the burial places tied to particular families and settlements, the local dead whose names were spoken around fires and remembered through presence rather than inscription? Did they remain powerful? Did they fade beneath the cults of royal ancestors and state gods? Did families continue to visit them quietly? Beyond official attention, archaeology can uncover graves, but it cannot fully measure the grief of traditions displaced by grander forms of memory. The local gods, too, may have changed. Before formal theology, sacred power likely lived in animals, places, objects, ancestors, masks, journeys, pigments, and seasonal acts. As the state grew, divine forces were named, ranked, associated with regions, drawn into royal ritual, and eventually housed in institutions with priests, offerings, estates, and official iconography. This gave gods endurance, visibility, and wealth. It also domesticated them. The wild powers of marsh, desert, animal, and grave were translated into systems that served cosmic monarchy. Something was preserved, something was lost. A local animal power could become a god known throughout Egypt, but in becoming grand, it may have shed older meanings that belonged only to one community, one hill, one bend in the river, one forgotten cemetery. Official religion is powerful because it gathers. It is dangerous because it simplifies. It tells the many stories of a land in a language controlled by fewer voices. The same may be said of art. Pre-dynastic imagery could be fluid, experimental, strange, and unstable. Boats drifted across pottery. Animals appeared with ambiguous force. Human figures moved between ceremony and symbol. Standards rose without full explanation. Meaning remained open, layered, and local. With the rise of the state, Egyptian art gained rules of extraordinary durability. Proportion, posture, scale, crown, gesture, and composition became part of a visual grammar that could communicate authority for millennia. This created one of the most recognizable artistic traditions on earth. It also reduced certain freedoms. A royal image could not simply be anything. It had to fit order. It had to show the king as king, the enemy as defeated, the offering as proper, the god as recognizable, the body as disciplined, the world as arranged. The state turned art into a language of permanence. In doing so, it quieted some of the older wildness. Even memory became selective. Writing gave Egypt history, but history written under kingship often serves kings. The names of rulers endured. The names of common laborers vanished. Victories were carved. Failures were softened or omitted. Unity was celebrated. Resistance was demonized or forgotten. The official record could speak loudly enough to drown out other voices. When we read early royal signs, we are not hearing Egypt as a whole. We are hearing those who gained the power to write. This does not make the record worthless. It makes it human. Every civilization remembers itself unevenly. Egypt was no exception. Its brilliance came with shadow. Its order came with compulsion. Its eternity came with exclusion. Its monuments came with silence. The great transformation that produced pharaohs also buried countless older ways of being, not always through deliberate destruction, but through absorption into structures too large for small traditions to resist. Yet loss is not disappearance in a simple sense. Older worlds survived in transformed ways. Village customs continued beneath state ritual. Local gods persisted within national religion. Animal symbolism retained ancient depth. Desert burial traditions shaped royal mortuary belief. River knowledge remained in the hands of those who lived by water. No matter what kings claimed, the state could organize Egypt, but it could not invent every root from which it grew. Beneath the polished surface of dynastic civilization, pre-dynastic memory continued to pulse, like water under stone, like seeds beneath silt, like old names whispered outside official hearing. There is a melancholy grandeur in this. Egypt became immortal by learning to fix itself into forms that could survive. But life before such fixing may have been more varied, more local, more fragile, and more free in ways no inscription could preserve. The cost of permanence was discipline. The cost of unity was subordination. The cost of official memory was forgetting. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know which communities mourned their lost independence. We do not know which local shrines faded when royal ritual expanded. We do not know how many village leaders became officials, how many resisted, how many were defeated, how many found advantage in the new order. We do not know what songs stopped being sung because no scribe wrote them down. We do not know what children were no longer taught when the old stories ceased to matter. But the question remains vital. What was lost in becoming Egypt? Perhaps a world where identity was smaller, but closer, where gods lived nearer to animals, graves, and particular landscapes, where authority had not yet hardened fully into divine monarchy, where memory belonged more to bodies, families, and places than to monuments and lists, where the future had not yet narrowed into the long, glittering corridor of kings. The Egypt that emerged was magnificent. It was also a transformation built upon endings. To honor that past honestly, we must look not only at the crown, but at what the crown covered, not only at the royal tomb, but at the village grave, not only at the official god, but at the unnamed power in the desert wind, not only at the written name, but at the lost voices no inscription saved. No, civilization is never born without burial, and in becoming Egypt, something older was laid beneath the sand. The long memory of the Nile is not kept only in pyramids. It is kept in mud, bone, sand, pottery, pigment, stone, silence, and the slow patience of the earth. It is kept in the faint outline of a grave cut into desert ground. It is kept in the curve of a painted boat on a broken vessel. It is kept in the polish of a stone pallet, in the drilled hole of a tiny bead, in the worn edge of a flint blade, in the ash of a hearth, in the post hole of a vanished hut, in the animal bones left from a feast whose voices have gone forever. These are humble things, and yet through them, the deep story of Egypt continues to breathe. For so long, the imagination of the world has entered Egypt through its most dazzling doors: the golden mask, the great pyramid, the temple wall, the royal mummy, the colossal statue. These things are magnificent, and they deserve their awe. But they are not the beginning. They are the flowering of roots that sank far deeper into the ancient soil. Beneath the age of kings lies the age of communities whose names were not preserved, whose gods were not fully written, whose leaders stand only as shadows, whose hands made the first shapes of a civilization not yet aware of what it would become. To look at pre-dynastic Egypt is to be reminded that history does not begin when writing begins. Human life is older than its records. Human thought is older than its inscriptions. Human wonder is older than its temples. The people who lived along the Nile before the pharaohs did not need pyramids in order to think about eternity. They did not need formal priesthoods in order to feel the sacred force of animals, ancestors, flood, desert, and sky. They did not need cartouches in order to understand identity. They did not need royal decrees in order to organize memory, labor, ritual, affection, and fear. They stood in the world with minds as complex as ours, though their tools, dangers, and explanations were different. That is perhaps the greatest lesson. The past was not inhabited by simpler souls. It was inhabited by human beings. They woke beneath dawns no eye will ever see again. They stepped into mud left by the flood. They watched cattle breathe in morning light. They heard birds cry over marshes. They feared crocodiles and drought. They buried children. They painted bodies. They shaped clay. They sharpened stone. They told stories beside fires. They carried rare shells from distant shores. They watched the desert advance and the river return. They lived within uncertainty and answered it with pattern, memory, ritual, and skill. The archaeology of this world is a discipline of fragments, but those fragments are enough to resist forgetting. Radiocarbon dating places them in time. Stratigraphic excavation restores their layers. Lithic analysis returns attention to the hand in the strike. Ceramic study follows the movement of taste, identity, and exchange. Bioarchaeology listens to bones for signs of labor, illness, diet, and trauma. Genomic data, fragile and incomplete, offers glimpses of ancestry and movement across landscapes where people met, mingled, and changed. Each method is a lamp held over a dark field. None reveals everything. Together, they show a world richer than legend and stranger than certainty. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden, and perhaps they always will. There is humility in that. Archaeology does not resurrect the past whole. It does not give us every song, every prayer, every private grief, every joke, every fear, every dream. It gives us traces and asks us to be careful with them. It teaches patience. It teaches restraint. It teaches that silence is not emptiness, and that absence is not proof of insignificance. The people before the pharaohs are gone, but they are not nothing. Their absence has weight. In the long road of human history, Egypt's emergence was one of the great acts of becoming. A river valley became a sacred land, villages became centers became kingdoms, symbols became writing, chiefs became divine rulers, graves became monuments, local memories became state ideology, mud and reed gave way to stone and gold. Yet the transformation was not magic. It was human accumulation across centuries, countless decisions, experiments, failures, adaptations, ceremonies, rivalries, migrations, and acts of care laid the foundation. Civilization is often imagined as a sudden sunrise. In truth, it is more like the flood. It rises gradually, fed by distant forces, gathering unseen strength, spreading across the plain, leaving behind a new surface on which life can begin again. The Nile taught Egypt to think in returns. Water vanished and came again. Fields died and revived. The sun set and rose. The dead were placed in dry sand, yet somehow remained. This rhythm entered the Egyptian imagination so deeply that it would shape one of the most enduring visions of eternity ever created. The later obsession with rebirth, preservation, order, and cosmic renewal did not fall from the sky. It grew from living beside a river that turned destruction into fertility year after year, year after. And this is why the world before the pharaohs matters. It shows us Egypt becoming itself before it could explain itself. It shows us humanity standing at the edge of statehood, not yet swallowed by the machinery of kings, but already moving towards something immense. It shows the first sacred symbols flickering into form. It shows inequality rising in graves. It shows trade routes binding distant places. It shows violence being transformed into royal language. It shows writing emerging from silence, not as poetry at first, but as memory attached to power. It shows how a civilization can grow from climate, landscape, ritual, ambition, and death, but it also warns us. Every civilization that becomes great also becomes selective in what it remembers. The monuments of Egypt survived because power made them to survive. The villages of the unnamed survived only by accident, by sand, by dryness, by the mercy of burial and neglect. The royal voice speaks loudly. The village voice must be recovered slowly, with brush and trowel, from what little remains. So we must listen differently, not only for kings, not only for gods whose names endured, not only for battles and crowns and dynasties, but for the people beneath the great story, the potter smoothing wet clay, the child buried with beads, the herder guiding cattle at the desert edge, the trader returning with shells, the craft worker striking flint with impossible precision, the mourner placing food beside the dead, the unknown hand drawing a boat on a vessel, perhaps never imagining that thousands of years later, someone would stare at that image and wonder what journey it was meant to carry. That wonder is the bridge between them and us. We live in another age of symbols, power, climate anxiety, migration, inequality, and memory. We too build systems larger than ourselves. We too inherit worlds shaped by people whose names we do not know. We too decide what to preserve and what to forget. The deep past is not distant because it is irrelevant. It is distant because we have forgotten how much of ourselves still lives there. The people before the pharaohs stand at the beginning of Egypt, but they also stand in the mirror of humanity. They remind us that greatness is not born clean. It emerges from mud, hunger, fear, beauty, violence, devotion, and the stubborn refusal to let the dead vanish completely. They remind us that the first monuments were not stone towers, but graves. The first archives were not libraries, but cemeteries. The first maps were not drawn on walls, but remembered in footsteps between water, field, and desert. The first kings were not inevitable. They were made. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. A grave still unopened may change a chronology. A fragment of bone may alter a story of ancestry. A settlement beneath silt may reveal a forgotten community. A broken label may preserve a name no one has spoken for 5,000 years. Beneath Egypt's dust, the past is not exhausted. It waits, silent but not empty. And so we leave the Nile not at an ending, but at a horizon. The river still flows through the land. The desert still holds its dead. The wind still moves across places where unnamed people once watched the sky and tried to understand the powers that governed their lives. Their world is gone, yet it remains beneath everything Egypt became. Before the pharaohs, There was something else. Not a void, not a prologue, a world. And in that world, the first long memory of Egypt began.